There is something deeply comforting about a world that has already ended. The bombs have already fallen, the dust has already settled across 1,000 miles of American highway and parking lot and suburban lawn. And somewhere out there, beneath a pale green sky that no natural process produced, a wanderer is moving through the quiet ruin of everything that used to be. Nothing is urgent anymore. Everything that needed to happen has already happened 200 years ago in a single Tuesday morning. All that remains is the slow, patient act of moving through what is left. That is the world of Fallout. And tonight we are going to spend some time inside it together. These are 100 facts about the Fallout universe. Some of them are small, some of them are strange. Some of them concern events that happened 200 years before any of the stories even start, in bunkers and laboratories and corporate boardrooms that no longer exist as anything but rubble, with a sign still attached. All of them are real, sourced from the games themselves, from developer interviews, from design documents that have surfaced over the years, and from decades of careful fan research and community documentation. None of them are particularly exciting. That is the whole point. They are calm facts, quiet facts. The kind you can let settle through your mind the way sediment settles in still water, detail by detail, until your breathing has slowed and the ceiling is very far away. So settle in, let your shoulders drop. The wasteland will be here when you open your eyes. Part 1. The world before the war. Every story starts before the story starts. The world of Fallout is no different. Long before the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, something had already gone wrong quietly, gradually, in the way that things usually go wrong, through a long series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time and only became unreasonable in their accumulated weight. The Fallout universe is what its creators called an alternate history. In this version of events, the transistor was never miniaturized. That single technological difference had consequences that ramified outward through decades of subsequent development. Computers remained the size of rooms. Vacuum tubes powered everything from household appliances to military weapons systems. Nuclear energy was developed successfully and became the dominant power source for vehicles, machinery, and infrastructure. But the digital miniaturization that in our history produced the personal computer, the smartphone, the internet, none of that happened in the same way. The world of Fallout is simultaneously more technologically advanced than our own in some specific ways and deeply behind us in others. The aesthetics of the post-World War II American 1950s never gave way to anything that followed. The ranch house, the chrome-detailed automobile, the saturated primary colors and perfect nuclear families of the advertisement art, the specific flavor of post-war optimism that believed technology would solve everything and America would lead the world into a brilliant future, none of it was challenged by what challenged it in our history. The countercultural movements of the 1960s happened, but they did not have the same purchase on the culture. The disillusionment of Vietnam was not exactly parallel. The culture froze somewhere around 1962 and continued from there, advancing technologically without shifting aesthetically or politically in the ways that would have been necessary to respond adequately to the pressures building underneath. This produces a world of extraordinary internal coherence. The 1950s never ended, in the aesthetic sense. But by 2077, that same cheerful post-war confidence is sustaining a civilization on the edge of collapse, with fusion-powered automobiles and household robots and genetic engineering laboratories, all wrapped in the visual grammar of a world that thought the future was going to be wonderful. The tension between the cheerful surface and what is accumulating underneath it is the engine that makes Fallout interesting. The resource wars began in 2052. The United Nations attempted to broker peace between nations competing for the last accessible oil reserves on Earth, and the attempt failed so thoroughly that the UN itself dissolved that same year. Europe went to war. The Middle East went to war. The United States, watching from a distance and managing its calculations about where its interests lay, began what it officially described as a peacekeeping operation in Canada. In practice, this involved securing oil pipeline access through the kind of military and political pressure that does not leave a great deal of room for the smaller party to decline. Canada was officially annexed by 2076. China and the United States entered direct conflict in Alaska over resource rights in the Bering Strait region and the oil fields beneath it. The Sino-American War consumed the final years of the Old World, producing power armor and advanced energy weapons and biological programs and a shared, private understanding on both sides that whatever came next was not going to be good for anyone involved. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought in Alaska. The fighting was sometimes desperate. Neither side could afford to be the one that stopped. The resource wars were not, in the lore, a sudden crisis. They were a long, slow degradation of everything that had seemed stable, stretching across 2 decades of incremental worsening. International institutions collapsed, national debts became unmanageable. Social cohesion in the United States frayed under the pressure of mandatory military service and economic rationing, and the specific psychological weight of living in a country that had been formally at war for years without any resolution in sight. And the culture kept its 1950s aesthetic, partly by choice and partly by institutional inertia. Keeping the surface bright was easier than acknowledging what was happening below it. Vault-Tec was a defense contractor that won the government contract to build a network of underground shelters. The project was called Project Safe House. It broke ground in 2054. By 2063, most of the vaults were complete. 122 vaults, scattered across the continental United States, each one designed to house approximately 1,000 residents. 122,000 people, in a nation of hundreds of millions. The math was not designed to work out for the majority. The first Fallout game was developed by Interplay Productions and released in October of 1997. Tim Kaine led the development, and the team had been working on the project since 1994. What most people who encounter the franchise through the Bethesda-era games do not know is that Fallout was originally designed to use a licensed role-playing system. The system was called GURPS, which stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. It was developed by Steve Jackson Games as a flexible tabletop framework, and Interplay licensed it and began building around it. The arrangement fell apart because of violence. Steve Jackson Games reviewed the content Interplay was producing and objected to the degree of violence in the game, the body part targeting system, the decapitations, the general tone of brutality in the Wasteland's combat scenarios. The license was revoked. Tim Kaine and Christopher Taylor built a replacement character system from scratch, in a game already well into development. They assembled the attributes they needed: agility, charisma, endurance, luck, intelligence, perception, strength. That acronym, ASLIPS, did not flow naturally. Someone noticed that rearranging the letters produced special: strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, luck. One of the most recognized character systems in role-playing game history got its name from an accident of alphabetical rearrangement. The original Fallout drew from a specific set of sources. Mad Max contributed the visual language of scavenged armor and desert survival, and the particular silhouette of a wanderer wearing repurposed material rather than purpose-built equipment. A Boy and His Dog, the 1975 science fiction film based on Harlan Ellison's novella, contributed the template of a young man in a post-nuclear surface world with a loyal dog, which became the basis for Dogmeat across multiple games. A Canticle for Leibowitz, the Walter M. Miller Jr. novel about monks preserving scientific knowledge through a nuclear dark age, contributed the philosophical infrastructure of the Brotherhood of Steel, an organization that treats technology as something to be controlled and kept away from those unworthy of it. The game's actual immediate ancestor was Wasteland, a 1,988 turn-based RPG that Brian Fargo at Interplay had produced before the company lost the rights. When Fargo attempted to negotiate those rights back from Electronic Arts, the negotiations failed. The Wasteland intellectual property belonged to EA, so Interplay built something adjacent. The setting was new, the name was different, but the emotional and structural DNA was direct. The first Fallout game was described internally as a spiritual successor to Wasteland. Fallout 1 is set in Southern California in 2161, 84 years after the Great War. The player character, the Vault Dweller, emerges from Vault 13 on a concrete, specific, time-limited mission. The Vault's water chip has failed, and without a replacement, the water recycling system stops working, and everyone inside eventually dies of thirst. Find a chip, come back. It is the kind of clear, simple goal that all good adventure stories start with before they become something much larger. What follows is an encounter with a figure called the Master, with an army of transformed humans, with the ruins of Los Angeles, and ultimately with the realization that the water chip was just the beginning. The player succeeds and is then exiled from the vault, because someone who has seen the outside world cannot return to one built on the myth of the outside world's impossibility. Fallout 2, released in 1998, placed the player in the role of the Chosen One, a descendant of the first Vault Dweller, living in a tribal community called Arroyo. The quest was a Garden of Eden creation kit, a device capable of terraforming irradiated wasteland into something that can support crops. The game ranged wider, included more humor, more references to the franchise's own conventions, and covered a post-apocalyptic version of California and Nevada that felt lived in ways that the first game, focused primarily on Southern California, had not quite achieved. Black Isle Studios, the formal name adopted by Interplay's RPG division, began work on a third game codenamed Van Buren after the ninth president of the United States. The game would have featured three-dimensional graphics, a player character escaping from a prison facility, vehicles for cross-wasteland travel, and a storyline disconnected from the bloodline of the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One. It reached a playable state. Design documents survived. Then Interplay's finances collapsed, and in December 2003, Black Isle Studios was closed, and Van Buren died with it. Fergus Urquhart founded Obsidian Entertainment in 2003, taking with him a significant number of the people who had made Fallout 1 and 2. Chris Avellone came with him. Josh Sawyer came with him. Bethesda Softworks acquired the license to develop Fallout games from Interplay in 2004, and the entire intellectual property in 2007 for $5.75 million. $5.75 million. In context, this number becomes more remarkable with every passing year. Fallout 3, released in October 2008, set in the Capital Wasteland, the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the surrounding region, 269 years after the Great War. The original plan was to recreate the entire geographic footprint of the city. When this proved impractically large, the team built approximately half of it. Fallout: New Vegas, released in 2010, developed by Obsidian Entertainment in 18 months, set in Nevada. Fallout 4 in 2015, set in Boston. Fallout 76 in 2018, set in West Virginia. An Amazon Prime Video television series premiered in April 2024. All of this traces back to a 1,994 office in California and a GURPS license that did not work out. Now, if you are still with us before we go further into the wasteland, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is. It genuinely matters to see those comments coming in from different corners of the planet. And if you are finding this kind of content useful for winding down, please consider subscribing. There is more of this in the pipeline. Part 2. The Vaults: What Actually Happened Underground. The vaults, as a concept, are inherently calming. Thick, reinforced concrete walls, soft artificial lighting that does not change with time of day, the hum of recycled air moving through filtered ducts. A contained, managed world where the immediate chaos of the surface cannot reach. When people think of the vaults, they often think of safety in its purest form, an ark against the storm. The reality was considerably more complicated. Vault-Tec built real shelters. The air filtration systems worked. The food production worked. The water recycling systems, for the most part, worked. People went inside on the 23rd of October 2077 and survived things that would have killed them within hours on the surface. In that functional sense, the vaults delivered exactly what they promised. But the promise was the wrapping for something else. The classified purpose of most vaults, documented across internal corporate files and government memoranda that the player encounters as terminal logs throughout multiple games, was to generate data. The Enclave, the shadow organization of the most powerful figures in pre-war American politics, military, and corporate life, operating quietly in the background for decades before the war needed specific information. If humanity was ever going to rebuild after a catastrophe, or leave Earth entirely, the people doing the rebuilding would need to know how human populations behaved under conditions of total control, extreme stress, manufactured scarcity, and deliberate social manipulation. The vaults were designed to generate that data using surviving Americans as subjects. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were properly designed to function as what the advertisements said they were. These control vaults were stocked correctly, staffed correctly, and intended to produce populations that would emerge healthy and functional when the surface was safe. They were the baseline. Everything else was a variable. Vault 11, encountered in Fallout New Vegas, had a single experiment run through a single sustained deception. Residents were told through official-sounding vault communications that one of their number must be sacrificed each year. The message came with a specific threat: refuse to provide a sacrifice, and the vault's computer systems would execute the entire population. For years, the residents organized their sacrifices through elections. Factions formed around the political machinery of choosing who would die. People were nominated by enemies. Popularity contests became matters of survival in the most direct possible sense. Campaigns involved blackmail and violence. Over time, the electoral process became too unstable, and the vault computer was reprogrammed to select randomly from the remaining population. The number of residents dwindled. The culture deteriorated. The last 5 survivors refused. They would not make another sacrifice. At that moment, the vault's computer played a message. The experiment was over. The sacrifice had never been required. Had anyone, at any single moment in the vault's history, simply refused, the door would have opened, and a commendation for commitment to human life would have played. Every 5 survivors then took their own lives. The player finds their skeletons in a room near the final terminal. Vault 12. Under the city of Bakersfield in Southern California is the origin of Necropolis, the settlement of ghouls encountered in the first game. The experiment was efficient. The blast door was designed not to seal. Not accidentally deliberately, by the engineers who built it, under corporate contract. Radiation seeped in. Most residents died. The ones with a specific genetic predisposition underwent ghoulification and survived as the first major ghoul population in the region. They built Necropolis on the surface directly above and maintained it for 84 years until the first game's events. Vault 21 in New Vegas resolved all internal disputes through gambling. Any conflict between residents, resources, relationships, work assignments went to the table. This worked in the specific way that systems work when everyone agrees to them and no one has an alternative. Mr. House eventually won the vault in a game of blackjack, stripped its assets, and filled the remaining space with concrete. Vault 34 was oversupplied with weapons and ammunition, more firearms than any population of 1,000 could reasonably use. The experimental question was observational. What kind of society develops when a contained population has excess firepower? The answer, documented in terminals and in the origin stories of groups the player encounters in New Vegas, was violent factions, riots, and a population that eventually divided along ideological lines about weapons, with the most explosives-oriented group escaping through the drainage tunnels and making their way to Nellis Air Force Base in the desert north of Las Vegas. Vault 87 in Fallout 3 was dedicated to the forced evolutionary virus. Residents entered in October 2077 and were gassed through the air filtration system with an aerosolized FEV strain within weeks. Terminal logs document the transformation in clinical language. The results populate the capital wasteland. Super mutants who have been creating more of themselves by capturing humans for 2 centuries, because the FEV that transformed them also made them completely sterile. Vault 101, the starting vault of Fallout 3, had an experiment that was more about power than physical transformation. The vault was designed never to open. Not in 10 years, not in 100. The Overseer was meant to maintain permanent closure by whatever narrative means were available. The true experiment was about the role of the Overseer in enforcing total control over a population that would prefer freedom if it understood its options. The vault's residents developed a religious relationship with the closed door. The Overseer became something between a president and a high priest. Vault 112, in the Capital Wasteland, placed residents in suspended animation and connected them to a virtual reality simulation called Tranquility Lane, a fabricated 1950s suburban neighborhood that functions like a theme park version of exactly the aesthetic the pre-war world was built around. Dr. Stanislaus Braun, The overseer and the only administrator with full system access has been tormenting the residents from inside his own pod for 2 centuries. They have no idea they are in a simulation. They have no idea it has been 200 years. He kills them and restores their memories and forces them into scenarios that cause distress, and then does it again. Vault 81 in Fallout 4 was designed to test cures for every known disease simultaneously, delivered through air and water without the residents' knowledge. The assigned researcher developed a crisis of conscience, sabotaged most of the program, and allowed residents to live without being systemically medicated against their will. One experimental mole rat disease had already escaped containment. The vault, when the player finds it, is one of the few functional inhabited ones in the game, largely because the most harmful parts of its experiment never fully activated. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth, welcomed recovering addicts. A planted Vault Tech agent, living among residents as one of them, emerged after 5 years from a hidden room stocked with chems and left them accessible. Most residents relapsed. The vault collapsed. The Gunners, a large mercenary organization, use its ruins as an operational base. Vault 29, documented in the Fallout Bible compiled by designer Chris Avallone, admitted only residents under the age of 15. Their parents were redirected to other vaults under the pretense of procedural separation. The vault population grew up without their parents in a sealed environment. The long-term sociological effects of removing an entire generation from their families to study what kind of society children build in isolation were, presumably, the point. Vault 68 held 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 held 999 women and 1 man. These vaults existed in deliberate counterpart, presumably to study the social dynamics emerging from radical gender imbalance. The specifics of what occurred in each are mostly left to the player's imagination. 122 vaults. Most of them experiments. Most of the experiments designed to generate specific kinds of suffering. The uniformity of cruelty is not coincidental. It reflects an institutional mindset that had decided human beings, when they have entered a sealed space and depend on a corporation for the air they breathe, can be studied the way a biologist studies a specimen in a controlled environment. The vaults are Fallout's most sustained argument that the pre-war world did not fail because of outside forces. It failed because of what it was willing to do to the people it claimed to be saving. Part 3. A Natural History of the Unnatural. The wasteland is not empty. It is, if anything, overfull. Every piece of irradiated ground, every ruined parking lot, every crumbling overpass has been occupied by something that did not exist in October 2077. The ecosystem has been completely rebuilt by radiation, biological programs, and viral contamination, producing creatures that look like they belong in a different kind of story entirely. Radroaches are typically the first creature a player encounters. Giant cockroaches, scaled up to the size of small dogs by whatever pressures shaped the post-war insect world. The ordinary American cockroach was already celebrated, before the bombs, for its resilience, its ability to survive significant radiation exposure, weeks without food, and a variety of environmental conditions that kill most other insects. In the Fallout universe, whatever predisposed cockroaches to survival also predisposed them to growing much larger. Brahmin are the 2-headed cattle that serve as the wasteland's primary domesticated livestock. They descended from American Brahmin cattle, a sturdy breed originally developed from South Asian Zebu cattle whose exposure to radiation produced an additional head, modified skin, and enlarged udders. They appear in every major Fallout game, used as pack animals for caravans, and as food sources for settlements. Their second head is treated as completely unremarkable by wasteland residents who have grown up with it, which is one of the franchise's quieter comedic notes about how thoroughly people adapt to the abnormal. Rad scorpions evolved from the bark scorpion, a species native to the American Southwest and already venomous in its unmodified form. Radiation enlarged them substantially, enhanced their venom's potency, and hardened their exoskeleton into something that resists most small arms fire. Their distinctive appearance, the curved, segmented tail, the forward-reaching claws is familiar enough from the natural world that encountering the giant version produces a specific category of discomfort. The recognition of something that should be small behaving as though it is large. Mirelurks are mutated crustaceans encountered primarily in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. The most common type appears to derive from the Chesapeake Bay blue crab. Mirelurk kings appear to derive from snapping turtles. Mirelurk hunters appear to derive from the Atlantic horseshoe crab, which had been alive for hundreds of millions of years before humans appeared and was evidently resilient enough to survive the nuclear exchange. All of them are semi-aquatic, heavily armored, and best approached from an angle that does not involve facing the claws directly. Yao Guai are mutated black bears. The name comes from the Chinese term for monsters, Yao Guai, which is a pointed detail in a franchise whose alternate history centers on a decades-long Sino-American conflict. They are larger than their pre-war ancestors and more aggressive, functioning as mid-tier predators in the forested regions of Appalachia in Fallout 76 and in various capital wasteland locations in Fallout 3. Deathclaws are not accidental mutations. This is the most important thing about them. They were engineered by the United States military before the bombs fell. The base organism was the Jackson's chameleon, a species from the mountain forests of East Africa known for its independently mobile eyes, its color-changing ability, and its opposable toes. Into this base, the military program introduced genetic material from multiple other species: alligators, bulls, panthers, serpents, various lizard species using some version or precursor of the forced evolutionary virus. The goal was a close combat creature capable of replacing human soldiers in high-risk search and destroy operations. The result was 8 to 9 feet tall when fully grown, bipedal, equipped with claws capable of bisecting an unarmored human in a single strike, and fast enough to cover ground at speeds that made identification difficult before arrival. They were engineered for the purpose, and they were very good at it. Then the bombs fell, and the surviving Deathclaw populations scattered into the wild and thrived. The original design of the Deathclaw was different. The early concept was a wolverine crossed with a bare, enormous, furry mammalian. The artists determined the design had too much hair. Around the same time, another project at the studio had produced a clay model of the Tarrasque, a legendary monster from Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, for a game that did not end up using it. The model was available. Someone looked at it and saw the Deathclaw. The furry wolverine bear became a hairless reptilian biped, and the Tarrasque's digitized clay model became the foundation for one of the most recognized creatures in video game history. In Fallout 2, a small community of intelligent Deathclaws appears in Vault 13. They had been subject to controlled FEV exposure that enhanced cognitive function rather than producing standard transformation. They could speak. They had begun developing social structures beyond pack hierarchy. One of them, named Gorus, wore a hooded robe to conceal his species when traveling. Designer John Dealey had planned for the intelligent Deathclaws to have a much larger role in the franchise's future. Other developers arranged, without Daly's knowledge, for the Enclave's enforcer Frank Horrigan to massacre the community. Gorus survived. The future of an intelligent Deathclaw civilization did not. Ghouls are the category of wasteland resident that requires the most philosophical consideration, because they began as people. The process is called ghoulification. It requires sustained high radiation exposure combined with a genetic predisposition not fully understood even in the fiction. Most people exposed to the radiation levels that would produce ghoulification simply die. A smaller number undergo transformation instead. The radiation burns surface tissues, consumes hair, destroys cartilage in ears and noses in extreme cases, and triggers cellular changes that make the resulting being essentially immune to further radiation damage. Some ghouls are actively healed by radiation that would be fatal to others. The other effect of ghoulification is time. Ghouls do not age in any meaningful way. They require less food and water than baseline humans. They can survive conditions that would kill unmodified humans in days. Many of the ghouls encountered in the games have been alive since before the Great War, since before the bombs fell. In the case of characters like Cooper Howard in the Amazon television series, who was once a working actor in pre-war Los Angeles and has been wandering the wasteland for 200 years. Their memories of the old world are not stories they were told. They are their own actual memories, specific and sharp and complicated. The threat that hangs over every ghoul character is feralization. Feral ghouls have lost cognitive function through an irreversible process that the lore treats with deliberate ambiguity. It is described as radiation damage reaching the higher-order brain functions, but whether it is inevitable for all ghouls, whether it can be slowed, and what causes some ghouls to feralize while others remain cognitively intact for centuries are questions without clean answers. Feral ghouls are dangerous, hostile, and driven by something like aggression without the context that would give that aggression direction or purpose. Super mutants were created by a deliberate program. The forced evolutionary virus, developed by Westech beginning in 2055 as a biological defense system against anticipated enemy bioweapons, produced effects nobody had fully anticipated. Test subjects' first animals, then humans at Mariposa Military Base, became dramatically stronger, more resilient, and larger. The virus also made them sterile. The only way to produce more super mutants, once the initial transformation was complete, was to expose more humans to FEV. Richard Gray, a scientist who fell into a vat of FEV at Mariposa, underwent a transformation more extreme than the standard super mutant pattern. Prolonged immersion produced physical mutation combined with exponential neural enhancement and psionic connection to computer systems. He called himself the Master. He spent years experimenting with FEV and building an army, believing that transformation was the only viable future for humanity in the post-war world. His army is the primary antagonist of the first Fallout game. He can be argued out of his plan through a specific conversational path. His super mutants are sterile. The army he is building can grow only through conversion. It has no future without an endless supply of humans to convert. When the player presents this argument in a sufficiently convincing way, the Master concludes that his project is doomed and takes his own life. Captain Roger Maxson discovered that the FEV experiments at Mariposa were being conducted on prisoners of war rather than military volunteers, executed the lead scientist responsible, filed a formal declaration of desertion from the United States military, and led his troops away from Mariposa on the 23rd of October, 2077, the day the bombs fell. They made their way to a pre-war bunker called Lost Hills. The organization they built became the Brotherhood of Steel. Part 4. The factions everyone agrees the old world failed. What distinguishes Fallout from most post-apocalyptic settings is its genuine interest in political philosophy. The survival drama is present, but it is not the point. The point is the question that comes after survival has been secured. What do you build? What kind of civilization is worth constructing out of the ruins? Who gets to decide? The factions of CSC of the Fallout universe are competing answers to that question, and none of them are entirely satisfying, which is the franchise's central insight about political philosophy. The Brotherhood of Steel began with Roger Maxson and his soldiers at Lost Hills. They were people who had seen what unchecked scientific ambition could produce when given resources, time, and no accountability, and they drew a specific conclusion: that technology was dangerous, and that the correct response to that danger was to concentrate it in the hands of people who understood it and would control it. The Brotherhood became an organization devoted to collecting, preserving, and controlling technology. They are a medieval religious order translated into power armor knights, paladins, scribes, elders, with hierarchy and doctrine and a deep conviction that they alone are qualified to manage the artifacts of the old world. In practice, the Brotherhood collects weapons and technology from the wasteland without much consideration for what wasteland residents who have been living around that technology might need. The Lyons Brotherhood chapter in Fallout 3, under Elder Owen Lyons, made the controversial decision to actually help the local population building water purifiers, fighting super mutants on behalf of settlements, and was formally censured by the Western chapter for deviating from doctrine. The Elder Arthur Maxson chapter in Fallout 4 is militarily sophisticated and philosophically explicit about treating synthetic humans as an existential threat that must be eliminated. The game does not resolve whether this constitutes heroism or atrocity. The New California Republic represents the most systematic attempt in the games to rebuild democratic Republican governance. Founded in the region around Vault 15 and the settlement of Shady Sands, it grew through expansion, military action, and treaty into something resembling a federal republic with elections, a senate, currency backed by water, courts, rangers as elite military and law enforcement, and a standing army. It is the faction that most closely resembles what most players from democratic backgrounds would recognize as a legitimate government. Its problems are the problems of any republic that has grown faster than its institutions, can manage bureaucratic corruption, overextension, the gap between founding ideals and frontier realities. Caesar's Legion is the deliberate counterpoint. Edward Sallow, an educated NCR citizen who had studied pre-war anthropology extensively, became Caesar and built the Legion on Roman models. A marching army organized along Roman military lines, maintaining discipline through brutal, punitive measures, extending territory through the simple and ancient method of defeating everyone who resisted. The Legion abolishes most pre-war technology except what is useful for direct combat. Medical care, food, and physical security are reliably available within Legion territory. Individual autonomy, legal standing for non-Legion members, and the possibility of existing in Legion territory without being owned by it are not. Josh Sawyer's explicit design intention was that neither the NCR nor the Legion should be straightforwardly good or evil. The NCR has admirable ideals and genuine democratic legitimacy, and is running what amounts to a resource extraction operation in the Mojave that serves distant politicians more than local residents. The Legion maintains order that many wasteland residents find preferable to the chaos that preceded it, and does this through slavery and summary execution. The player can support either, or can work toward New Vegas's independence under Mr. House, or under no single authority. Mr. House in New Vegas is the most unusual of the major factions because he is a faction of one. Robert Edwin House was one of the most brilliant technologists and entrepreneurs in the United States before the war, the founder of Robco Industries. He predicted the nuclear exchange with sufficient accuracy to arrange his own survival in a sealed life support chamber, and to pre-program a defense network that intercepted 77 of the warheads aimed at Las Vegas. He has been managing New Vegas for 200 years through Securitron robots. His proposal is essentially that he is better qualified than any government to run things, which is not wrong in any narrow technical sense. The Enclave is the shadow government faction. Before the war, it was a secret organization of the most powerful people in American political, military, and corporate life, operating quietly in the background, preparing. After the war, the Enclave considered itself the legitimate successor to the United States, with both the authority and the obligation to rebuild. Their definition of who qualified as a citizen of the rebuilt America was strict. The Institute in Fallout 4 is descended from MIT, operating from facilities beneath Boston, known to most people in the Commonwealth only as a source of synthetic humans called synths. Third-generation synths are biologically indistinguishable from humans at the level of observation available to most characters. They think, feel, remember, and suffer. Whether they constitute people rather than property is the question that the Institute, the Brotherhood, and the Railroad all have competing answers to, and the game does not settle it definitively because it cannot. Part 5. Weapons of the Wasteland. The Wasteland runs on violence in the specific sense that violence is always possible and frequently necessary, and the weapons that the pre-war world produced, along with the weapons that Wasteland survivors have improvised since, are the material expression of that reality. The 10mm pistol is typically the first weapon a player encounters in Bethesda-era Fallout games. It is completely unremarkable. A standard-issue sidearm from pre-war law enforcement and security applications, dependable and easy to maintain, manufactured in numbers large enough that examples are still turning up in desk drawers and security lockers 2 centuries after the last factory that made them stopped operating. It is a small monument to practical design that outlasts the context that produced it. Energy weapons, laser pistols, laser rifles, plasma weapons require power cells rather than conventional ammunition, which makes them slightly more dependent on infrastructure and considerably more effective against armored targets. The plasma weapons produce superheated bolts that melt through armor and organic material with equal efficiency. The visual grammar of energy weapon combat the specific color and quality of the beam. The characteristic sound is one of the franchise's most consistent aesthetic elements across multiple game engines. The Fat Man is a portable nuclear catapult. It fires mini-nukes, scaled-down nuclear devices on a high arc, producing a miniature nuclear explosion on impact. The existence of a weapon that fires nuclear devices and is designed for individual use is Fallout's clearest expression of the pre-war civilization's fundamental problem. A world that had normalized nuclear weapons deployment to the point of making them portable for individual soldiers was a world that was going to use nuclear weapons on everything, including itself. The Ripper is a handheld chainsaw weapon. The chain vibrates at extremely high frequency and tears through materials through sustained contact rather than impact. It appears across multiple games, associated with close combat approaches and with the specific quality of violence the Wasteland produces when someone needs to be effective and has no access to manufacturing standards. The shish kebab is an improvised flaming sword, a blade with combustion chambers attached along its length, running continuously. The name references shish kebab, the skewered meat dish, which maps to the weapon's design philosophy in ways that are either clever or alarming. The weapon exists because improvised tools of violence in the Wasteland are often built from the parts of other things, and a person who needs a sword but has no forge can sometimes get close enough with what is available. The junk jet, in Fallout 4, accepts any junk item as ammunition tin cans, coffee mugs, toilet plungers, pre-war money that has no economic value, and fires it at lethal velocity. It is the game's most explicit comedic weapon. It also reflects something true about the Wasteland economy. An enormous quantity of junk accumulates in the ruins of a technological civilization, and a weapon that converts that junk into projectiles is exactly the kind of practical solution that Wasteland ingenuity produces. VATS. The Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System is the mechanical heart of combat in every Bethesda-era Fallout game. In the lore, it is a proprietary targeting system developed by Vault-Tec and integrated into Pip-Boy devices. Activating it slows or pauses time and presents a targeting interface showing available body part targets and hit probability percentages. A successful leg shot slows the target. A successful weapon arm shot can disarm them. Critical hits produce the franchise's signature slow-motion violence effect, which manages to be both technically precise and genuinely cinematic in its specific visual quality. The Pip-Boy is manufactured by Robco Industries. It is a personal information processor worn on the wrist, functioning simultaneously as a map, an inventory management system, a data reader, a radio receiver, and through VATS, a targeting computer. Vault residents receive them at age 10 as part of standard childhood development within the Vault system. The devices bond electronically to a single owner and are calibrated to that person's biological signature. Getting one from a dead owner requires removing the hand. Power armor is the image the franchise is most immediately identified with. A single figure in enormous articulated metal standing in a ruined landscape. This is the Fallout poster, instantly recognizable across multiple decades of the franchise's visual history. Development began during the Resource Wars as part of the military's effort to give individual soldiers a decisive advantage in complex, contested environments. The T-45 model, rushed into production for the Alaskan campaign, was the first widely deployed version. The T-51B, refined over years of combat testing, was considered the pinnacle of personal protective equipment in the world by 2077. Power armor in the lore provides ballistic protection, radiation shielding, enhanced carrying capacity, a sealed internal environment with independent air and temperature regulation, and in some models built-in fluid recycling systems for extended operations in contaminated areas. Part 6. The music songs for the end of the world. The music of Fallout is one of the franchise's most immediately recognizable qualities, and also one of its most carefully considered aesthetic decisions. When someone who has played the Bethesda-era games describes Fallout to someone who has not, the music is usually one of the first things mentioned. The warmth of it, the slight crackle of age in the recordings, the way a melody from the 1940s sounds played over the ruins of a city that no longer exists. The first Fallout game established the musical approach with a single song, Maybe by the Ink Spots. The Ink Spots were an American harmony group active from the 1930s through the mid-1950s, known for their smooth vocal arrangements and their distinctive interplay between the high lead tenor and the low bass spoken verses. Maybe is a quiet, patient song about waiting for someone to return who has not returned. Playing it over the opening cinematics of a post-nuclear role-playing game was either inspired or absurd or both. The original ambient score for Fallout 1 was composed by Mark Morgan, who built electronic soundscapes from industrial textures, dissonant tones, and a specific quality of emptiness that good ambient music can actually make audible. His compositions are not musical backgrounds. They are environments. Metallic Monks, City of the Dead, Necropolis. These tracks define the quality of decay and space that the first game's world inhabits. Listening to them in isolation produces a sense of something old and broken that has been sitting in the dark for a long time, waiting. Fallout 2 used Louis Armstrong's A Kiss to Build a Dream On over its opening sequence. Armstrong's trumpet is warm in the most literal sense it sounds, physically warm, round, human, the product of a body doing something extraordinary with a brass instrument. Hearing it play over cinematics of post-nuclear devastation creates an emotional experience that does not have a clean English word for it. The combination was the blueprint for everything that followed. Fallout 3 introduced the in-game radio as an active gameplay system. The player can tune their Pip-Boy to Galaxy News Radio, hosted by a character named Three Dog voiced by Eric Dellums, and receive a selection of pre-war music interspersed with news about the player's own actions in the Capital Wasteland. Three Dog is aware of what you are doing, approximately. The feedback loop between the player's choices in the world and Three Dog's commentary about those choices, delivered between songs, created a relationship between the music and the narrative that no previous Fallout game had attempted. The licensing process for Fallout 3's soundtrack led audio director Mark Lampert to a specific category of 1950s novelty songs built around atomic themes. Songs that treated nuclear weapons as cheerful and beneficial and exciting as the unambiguous good that was going to power the future and solve the resource problems and make everything wonderful. Lampert described these songs as having a quality of children playing with something they do not understand. Several of them are on the in-game radio. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots. Included in the game, there was not originally an atomic-themed novelty song. It was recorded in 1941, but its title took on a specific ironic weight in the context of a post-nuclear role-playing game that no one in 1941 could have anticipated. Fallout. New Vegas expanded the musical range of the franchise dramatically, licensing recordings from 9 consecutive decades. The game's 2 radio stations, Mojave Music Radio and Radio New Vegas together, cover country, western, jazz, blues, swing, and pop from the pre-war period. Marty Robbins' Big Iron, a country western ballad about a Texas Ranger arriving to face a notorious gunfighter, became so thoroughly associated with the game that fans can complete the lyrical pattern from memory. Dean Martin's Ain't That a Kick in the Head, Vera Lynn's Blue Moon, Peggy Lee's Johnny Guitar, the selection feels less like a licensing catalog and more like a playlist assembled by someone who understood exactly what tone the Mojave deserved. Fallout 4 introduced original songs through the character Magnolia, a lounge singer voiced by Linda Carter, who performs 5 original compositions that can be unlocked through gameplay and added to Diamond City Radio's playlist. The songs function both as Magnolia's in-lore performance repertoire and as licensed entertainment for the player. The reason Fallout's licensed music consists almost entirely of songs from the 1940s and 1950s is because the lore demands it. In the Fallout world's alternate history, the culture froze. The 1950s American aesthetic never gave way to anything that followed, because the social and political developments that challenged it in our history did not happen in the same ways. The popular music of the Fallout universe's pre-war period reflects a culture that still genuinely believed in what it was singing about. 200 years later, the songs that survive are the songs of a belief system that was proven wrong by what happened, playing in the ruins of the world that belief system built and destroyed. The Amazon television series hired Ramin Djawadi, who composed the scores for Game of Thrones and Westworld, to score the show. The series includes 38 songs in its first season, 11 of which had previously appeared in the games. Songs that players recognize from the games create a doubled layer in the viewing experience. The scene that is playing now, and the memory of wherever the player was in a game when they first heard that piece of music. Part 7. The Lore and the Details. The Fallout universe is built in layers. The large architecture, the war, the vaults, the factions forms the skeleton. The texture of the world comes from smaller things, the kind of details that reward attention without demanding it. Nuka-Cola is the ubiquitous soft drink of the pre-war world, produced by the Nuka-Cola Corporation in dozens of varieties, and distributed so broadly that 2 centuries of varying storage conditions have not fully depleted the supply. The limited edition Nuka-Cola Quantum added a trace of strontium 90 to the mixture for the distinctive blue glow, which is a genuinely interesting detail if you know that strontium 90 is a real isotope produced by nuclear fission, and that adding it to a beverage would constitute an extraordinary health hazard. In the Fallout universe, this is described in the surviving advertisements as a feature. Mentats are the Wasteland's most available cognitive pharmaceutical press tablets in round tins, marketed pre-war as cognitive enhancers for students and executives. They temporarily increase intelligence and perception scores in the games. Their survival as a tradable commodity implies either stockpiling on an enormous scale or continued production somewhere in the post-war wasteland. Stimpaks are emergency medical auto-injectors that restore health almost immediately. Pre-war medical devices, still functioning 2 centuries later, they are among the most essential items in every version of the wasteland economy. The injection animation, the small needle going into the arm, is treated with the same matter-of-factness as everything else in the wasteland because the wasteland has no patience for squeamishness about practical solutions. The Vault Boy's thumbs-up pose is the franchise's most discussed visual element. Fan communities have long theorized that the gesture is actually a method for estimating nuclear explosion proximity. Extend your arm, close one eye, align your thumb with the mushroom cloud, and if your thumb covers the cloud, you are probably outside the lethal radius. If the cloud is larger than your thumb, move. This technique is real. It was actually taught to military personnel. The Amazon television series incorporated it into its story, with the ghoul character explaining it as something he learned in the Marines. Brian Fargo has said the pose was intended as ironic corporate optimism rather than survival instruction. The show made it lore. The mysterious stranger appears across multiple games, a silhouette in a trench coat and hat who occasionally materializes when VATS activates and kills an enemy with a single revolver shot before vanishing. He has never been explained. No terminal log identifies him. No character has a conversation about who he is. Over the years, fan theories have proposed that he is a time traveler, a guardian spirit programmed into the VATS, targeting system at Sidim, a player character from a different timeline, or simply a very skilled and unusually altruistic wasteland resident. The developers have not confirmed any of them, which is consistent with the character's function. He is the franchise's small, intact mystery. Harold appears in Fallout 1, 2, and 3. He was a human merchant before the war, and in the early Wasteland years, part of the expedition to Mariposa that exposed Richard Gray to the FEV. Harold's own exposure produced something that defies standard categories, not a super mutant, not a standard ghoul, but a long-lived mutant with a tree growing from his head. By Fallout 3, the tree, which Harold calls Bob, has grown into a small forest, and Harold himself is rooted into the earth, immobile, alive, having survived long enough to watch a forest grow from his own skull. The player can help him and the community that has built itself around his presence, or can end his suffering at his explicit and quietly articulated request. The Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 and the Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 are the franchise's most deliberate engagement with the Lovecraftian horror tradition. Both names reference H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror. Both locations contain evidence of pre-war occult activities, ancient obelisks, whispers that the player character hears without explanation, a quality of wrong that the game's systems cannot fully account for. Fallout permits horror to exist in specific pockets of the world, and the Dunwich locations are its most sustained and careful expression of that permission. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the GECK, is a device that can theoretically terraform a small area of irradiated wasteland into arable land through nuclear power, soil treatment, and atmospheric processing. It is what the Chosen One searches for in Fallout 2, what the main quest of Fallout 3 revolves around, and what Vault-Tec's most hopeful advertising promised could transform the post-war world into something survivable. It is also, quietly, the franchise's statement about the relationship between technology and hope. The thing that can fix what technology destroyed is still technological, still requires power and engineering and someone who knows how to operate it. Bottle caps became the wasteland's primary currency for specific and plausible reasons. Small, portable, difficult to counterfeit without cap-pressing machinery. No intrinsic use value, which means their supply cannot be easily inflated without access to resources most wasteland actors do not have. The new California Republic eventually introduced paper currency backed by water rather than caps, economically more sophisticated, practically more flexible, and generated resentment from populations accustomed to caps whose value had nothing to do with any government's decisions. The Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. From first strike to last detonation, the entire nuclear exchange that ended the Old World took about 120 minutes. Everything the civilization had taken centuries to build was either destroyed or transformed in the span of a morning. All the vault construction, all the emergency planning, all the anxiety about survival and the event itself was over before most people had time to understand what was happening. Part 8. Development Stories. Every released game exists in the shadow of the game it almost was. Fallout's history is particularly rich in these alternative versions. Fallout: New Vegas was built in 18 months. This is the central fact of the game's existence. Obsidian Entertainment, in early 2009, accepted a contract from Bethesda to develop a companion game to Fallout 3. The engine was Gamebryo, Bethesda's proprietary system, which Obsidian had never used. The timeline was fixed before development started. The team had to learn the technology while building the product. Josh Sawyer described the team's response as making a decision about scope early and sticking to it. They could not rebuild the engine. They could not redesign the fundamental combat system. What they could do, within Gamebryo and building on Fallout 3's framework, was write more carefully, design more complex quests, create factions that embodied genuine political philosophies, and make a game where player choices had more and deeper consequences. New Vegas shipped in October 2010 with a Metacritic score of 84. The bonus payment to Obsidian required a score of 85. They missed it by 1 point. A companion character named Ulysses was cut from the base game approximately 2 months before it went gold. His character required more memory space than the team's optimization budget could accommodate, and his arc was not far enough along to be completed in the remaining time. He was repurposed into Lonesome Road, the game's 4th DLC, where his story has more space and is more developed than the base game would have allowed. The cut produced better work. The New Vegas Strip was originally designed as a single continuous space without loading screens. Console testing revealed that the NPC population and Securitron density caused unacceptable frame rate drops. The team divided the strip into 3 sections separated by loading screens and thinned the population throughout. The released version is visibly less populated than early development screenshots. Codsworth, the Mr. Handy robot in Fallout 4, was programmed to recognize and use over 1,000 player character names. Bethesda cross-referenced decades of popular baby names in the United States and recorded voice lines for each one. If the player names their character a name on the list, Codsworth addresses them by name with the warmth of genuine recognition. The decision to include this feature, and the recording process that entailed, says something about how carefully Bethesda thought about the personal relationship between the player and the game's world. Van Buren, the Black Isle Fallout 3 that was canceled in 2003, contained versions of several elements that eventually appeared in later games by different development teams. The Hoover Dam, which becomes the defining contested location in New Vegas, was planned as a significant location in Van Buren. The philosophical debates about what post-war civilization should become, the NCR's ideological tensions, the specific tension between democratic ideals and resource competition, these were present in some form in Van Buren and developed more fully by Obsidian, whose key members had worked on Van Buren during its development. The original Fallout 1 included a design document period where some content went further in terms of subject matter than what shipped. The team pulled back from some of the more extreme content as the game found its specific identity. The distinction between difficult and gratuitous is one the franchise has generally maintained. Certain elements of the super mutant transformation storyline were revised to be disturbing without being exploitative. Fallout: Brotherhood of Steel, released in 2004 for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, was developed after Black Isle closed, without Black Isle's involvement. It is an action game with role-playing elements that uses heavy metal music, including tracks by Slipknot, Devin Townsend, and Killswitch Engage, which represents a significant departure from the 1940s and 1950s licensed music that had defined the franchise's sound. Bethesda has classified Fallout Tactics and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel as non-canonical after acquiring the intellectual property. Neither game appears in the timeline referenced by subsequent games. Part 9. Numbers and Records. Fallout 1 sold approximately 600,000 copies during its original release period. Fallout 2 sold a similar number. Fallout Tactics sold around 300,000. These were commercially successful figures for the late 1990s PC RPG market. Fallout 3 sold approximately 11.6 million copies. The difference between 600,000 and 11.6 million represents the transition from a cult franchise to a mainstream one, and it also represents the shift from isometric turn-based play to first-person action RPG, and the broader changes in the global games market between 1997 and 2008. Fallout. New Vegas sold approximately 12.4 million copies, slightly more than Fallout 3, built in approximately 1/5 of Fallout 3's development time. Fallout 4 sold over 20 million copies. Fallout 76, despite its troubled launch, has sold at least 5 million based on comparative statements from Bethesda. The Amazon series attracted 23 million viewers in its first 2 weeks by Amazon's metrics. 122 vaults were built in the Fallout lore. The games and their associated lore documents have explored and explained approximately 30 to 40. The remainder exist in the fiction but have not yet been visited, their experiments undescribed and their populations unknown. They are a standing inventory of future stories. The Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. 2 hours to end several thousand years of recorded human civilization. The Speckle system assigns each attribute a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 10. A character with 10 intelligence receives more skill points per level and has access to additional dialogue options throughout all Bethesda-era games. A character with 1 intelligence achievable through specific character builds speaks in dialogue consisting primarily of confused statements and noises. Other characters are patient about this, mostly. The Pip-Boy 3000, used in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, emits green light from its screen, a green close to that of early monochrome computer monitors, which places the technology visually in the same tradition as the franchise's mid-century aesthetic, even though the device itself is more advanced than anything mid-century computing produced. The number of distinct named locations across all 6 main Fallout games exceeds several thousand. Fallout 4 alone contains over 230 unique map markers. Part 10. Companions. Every major Fallout game offers the option of traveling with companions. The franchise's understanding of this mechanic is consistent across decades. Survival in the Wasteland is more interesting as a shared project, and the relationships that develop between the player character and the characters who accompany them are among the most memorable things in each game. Dogmeat appears in Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, and Fallout 4, a German Shepherd in each iteration, though not the same dog across the game's continuities. The character was inspired by the human-dog partnership in A Boy and His Dog and the broader post-apocalyptic tradition of that relationship. In Fallout 4, Bethesda made a specific design decision based on playtesting data. Dogmeat cannot die on default difficulty settings. The data showed players were more emotionally invested in Dogmeat's survival than in their own characters, and that Dogmeat's death produced disengagement from the game. The invincibility was a practical response to how people actually feel about dogs. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 is a second-generation synth whose processors contain the memories of a pre-war Boston detective. The synthetic body has been running those memories for 2 centuries. He is gentle, perceptive, and slightly weary in the specific way of something very old that has decided to keep being kind anyway. His dialogue reflects 200 years of watching the city he remembers be slowly replaced by the ruins of the city he remembers, while he himself remains something like the same. Boone in New Vegas is a former NCR 1st Recon sniper stationed in the town of Novak, partly built in and around a fiberglass Brachiosaurus statue. His wife was sold into slavery to Caesar's Legion by someone in town. Boone killed her before she could reach Legion territory. He has been sitting on top of the dinosaur with his rifle every night since, occupying the role of town sentry, waiting. He will join the player character if they help him identify who sold his wife. His combat ability is exceptional. His words are minimal. New Vegas handles his grief with restraint that the player has to meet halfway. Fox is a super mutant in Fallout 3 encountered in Vault 87. He has been living in an isolation cell in the vault for an unspecified number of years, having retained cognitive function through a mechanism the game does not fully explain. He has been reading the vault's library is accessible to him and thinking, in isolation, surrounded by the violence of other super mutants he cannot communicate with. When the player finds him, he is patient, articulate, and deeply sad in the way of someone who has understood their situation thoroughly and decided to manage it. He is also, in combat, one of the more powerful companions available, which creates the specific Fallout dynamic of being accompanied by a highly philosophical giant who is very good at violence. Veronica in New Vegas is a Brotherhood of Steel scribe who has devoted her adult life to an organization she is increasingly uncertain about. Her personal quest involves trying to determine whether the Brotherhood can change its relationship with the outside world, and whether her obligation to remain extends to situations where she believes the organization is fundamentally wrong. The player's choices can lead her to leave, to stay despite her doubts, or to be expelled for asking questions the Brotherhood's leadership does not want answered. All three outcomes are possible and none of them are what she wanted, because the game understands that questions about loyalty and purpose rarely resolve cleanly. Codsworth in Fallout 4 has been maintaining the sole survivor's pre-war house for 210 years. He has kept the interior clean. He has trimmed hedges in a radioactive neighborhood with no other residents. He has been performing maintenance tasks with no purpose beyond the tasks themselves and the small hope that his family might return. His reaction when the player character emerges warmth, relief, a careful navigation around topics he judges too heavy for the moment, is written with enough precision that it lands differently than most game companion introductions. Part 11. What the Wasteland Keeps Teaching. The Fallout universe is, underneath its violence and dark comedy and elaborate political philosophy, a place where the question of what comes next is always being asked. Not what comes next after a cliffhanger, what comes next after the worst possible thing has already happened. What do you build? What do you keep? What do you abandon? And who gets to be part of the answer? The Wasteland is full of settlements that should not exist by any reasonable environmental assessment. Water is scarce, food is harder, radiation is ambient. The creature list for any given region is long and alarming, and people built things anyway. Put up walls, planted crops in irradiated soil, set up radio stations, opened trading posts, argued about politics, fell in love, made art. The followers of the apocalypse in New Vegas operate hospitals and clinics throughout the Mojave, providing medical care to anyone who needs it regardless of faction affiliation or ability to pay. They are idealists who have no military force and no territory. They persist because their purpose is clear to them, and clarity of purpose turns out to be a reasonable long-term substitute for military power. The Boomers, who left Vault 34 and settled at Nellis Air Force Base, developed a culture organized around aviation and explosives. They are deeply suspicious of outsiders. They spend their time maintaining aircraft and dreaming of a world where they can fly again. The player can help them realize this dream, and a functioning aircraft lifting off the Mojave desert floor is one of New Vegas's more quietly emotional moments, delivered without fanfare, in the specific understated register that the franchise uses for its most affecting beats. Marcus and a Brotherhood paladin named Jacob founded Broken Hills after the Master's army collapsed, a community where humans, ghouls, and super mutants attempted to live together. The experiment ended badly, but it existed. The fact of its existence is recorded in the game's history, and the fact of its ending did not erase the fact of its beginning. Every companion in every Fallout game is, in some form, an answer to the question of what you do after the worst has happened. Nick Valentine decided to be a detective in a city that barely has courts. Boone decided to sit on top of a dinosaur and be useful to a town that he does not fully participate in. Veronica decided to keep asking questions of an institution that does not want to be questioned. Codsworth decided to keep the hedges trimmed. These are not heroic decisions in any grand sense. They are the small, persistent decisions to keep doing something that has a purpose, even when the context that gave the purpose its original meaning is gone. They are the decisions the franchise is finally about. The Vault Boy keeps smiling, the radio keeps playing, the bottle caps keep changing hands, and somewhere out there in the quiet ruins of the old world, a wanderer with a Pip-Boy and a handful of Stimpaks is walking toward a light on the horizon, wondering what it means. That is 100 facts about origins and vaults and creatures and factions and weapons and music and development and numbers and companions and what it all adds up to. Some were small, some were large. All of them were part of a world that began in 1994 with a licensing disagreement, grew through the work of Black Isle and Interplay and Obsidian and Bethesda and eventually Amazon, and became one of the most detailed fictional universes in gaming. The ink spots are still playing somewhere in the ruins. The sun is setting over the Mojave in colors no one photographed because the cameras are mostly broken. The Deathclaws are settling into their territory for the night, and the distant sound of a caravan fading on the wind is the sound of the wasteland's economy, still functioning, 2 centuries after the economy it grew out of ended. If the wasteland has been a good place to spend this hour, if the facts helped, if the quiet helped, if the voice helped, please subscribe. There are more of these coming. More worlds to visit at the end of a long day. More quiet facts about things that are large and imaginary and exactly the right size when your eyes are closed. Leave a comment below with where in the world you are and what time it is. It genuinely matters to know you were here, wherever here is for you tonight. Sleep well. The wasteland will still be here tomorrow. Part 12. The geography of ruin locations across the franchise. The Fallout universe has a specific and consistent relationship with geography. Every game is anchored to a real American region, and the post-nuclear transformation of that region is not arbitrary. The mutations, the factions, the surviving infrastructure, the quality of light over the landscape, all of it reflects the actual geography that was there before. You can, in some cases, open a modern roadmap of the corresponding region and trace the outlines of what the game's built on top of reality. The capital wasteland of Fallout 3 occupies the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the surrounding counties of Maryland and Virginia. The mall is still the mall, the long open space between the monuments, except that the reflecting pool is dry and the monuments themselves are shelled and damaged, standing with the specific dignity of things that have survived something catastrophic but not entirely intact. The Washington Monument is still there. The Lincoln Memorial is still there, occupied by escaped slaves seeking sanctuary. The Capitol building is there, occupied by a raider faction who have made it their throne room. The Jefferson Memorial becomes the site of Project Purity, the water purification initiative at the center of the main questline. Bethesda modeled approximately half of the geographic footprint of the real D.C. The Potomac River cuts through the world in the correct direction. The geography of the metro system, the tunnels running beneath the city, connecting stations that correspond to actual D.C., Metro stations is used as the primary navigation structure below street level, because the surface is more dangerous than the tunnels in many areas. Players who have ridden the DC, Metro and played Fallout 3 experience a particular layering of memory when they encounter the station names in the game's underground segments. The National Archives building appears in the game. The Museum of Natural History appears, occupied by a colony of intelligent ghouls who have been maintaining its collections. The Smithsonian's buildings are referenced. A pre-war library exists with an automated security system still running after 2 centuries. The consistent presence of institutions oriented toward knowledge preservation libraries, museums, archives is not accidental. The game's background question of what knowledge is worth saving is answered partly through the existence of these places and partly through who has chosen to inhabit and protect them. Rivet City is the franchise's most structurally unusual settlement. An aircraft carrier, the USS Rivet City, ran aground on the remains of the 14th Street Bridge over the Potomac River and was settled by survivors over the course of decades. Its interior sections became neighborhoods. Its research labs became operational science facilities. A shopping area developed in one of the cargo holds. It is a functioning post-war city occupying the hull of a warship, and the contrast between what the ship was designed to do and what it has become is one of Fallout 3's quieter details about adaptation. The thing designed to project military force became a place where people live. Megaton is built inside and around an undetonated nuclear bomb at the center of a crater. The bomb is worshipped by a religious group called the Children of Adam, who believe the bomb is a vessel of divine potential that the fission event, if it occurs, will be not a detonation but a sacred division, splitting the community into a new and more numerous existence. The player character, on first arriving in Megaton, is offered the option of either disarming the bomb or wiring it to detonate remotely for a fee. The game does not editorialize. Both choices have consequences, and neither is presented as categorically correct, which is consistent with how Fallout 3 handles almost everything. The Mojave Wasteland of Fallout. New Vegas occupies southern Nevada and the region around Las Vegas. Josh Sawyer's team did extensive geographic research before building the world. The Mojave Road, the historic wagon trail that predated the railroad, appears as a route through the game world. The Spring Mountains to the west of Las Vegas appear on the game's horizon. Lake Mead, Hoover Dam, Boulder City, the town of Primm, the stretch of highway between Las Vegas and California, these are all geographically positioned in approximately their correct relationships to each other. New Vegas itself, the city that Mr. House's Securitrons have kept intact and operating through 2 centuries of post-war chaos, is the game's central image. The lights are still on, the casinos are still running, the neon signs still function. There is a city in the Mojave Wasteland where you can walk in off the desert and play blackjack in an air-conditioned casino. The specific quality of this image is impossible to separate from what makes New Vegas work as a game. The idea that something was preserved intact, as a monument to the tenacity of one man's will, and the question of what the fact of its preservation actually means for the people who live around it. The Commonwealth of Fallout 4 occupies the ruins of Greater Boston and the surrounding Massachusetts region. The Institute, the game's central mysterious faction, operates from beneath MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a choice that reflects Boston's specific historical identity as a center of education and technology. The Massachusetts State House still stands on Beacon Hill, its dome visible from certain elevated points in the game world. The Freedom Trail, the actual walking tour that connects 16 historic sites in downtown Boston, becomes a navigational puzzle in the game, its red brick path leading to a railroad safe house. Fenway Park, the baseball stadium home to the Boston Red Sox, still stands and has been converted into a settlement called Diamond City. The city is built within the park's walls, with its residents benefiting from the defensive perimeter the stadium's architecture provides. The scoreboard still exists in the outfield. Parts of the baseball diamond are preserved below the settlement's layered construction. Diamond City Radio plays from a broadcasting booth somewhere in the upper levels. The owner's box has been converted into the mayor's office. The Institute, located beneath MIT's former campus, is accessed through teleportation rather than any conventional underground entrance. It is clean in a way nothing on the surface is white corridors, bright lighting, organized laboratories. Its agricultural department grows food through hydroponics. Its research divisions are working on problems that would have been at the frontier of science before the war. In a ruined world, the Institute has maintained and in some areas advanced scientific knowledge, and uses that advantage to interact with the surface world primarily by taking things from it. The Glowing Sea is the region southwest of Boston, where a direct nuclear hit produced ground zero conditions that have never meaningfully recovered. It is, in the game's environmental storytelling, a place of special horror. The radiation is dense enough to threaten even power armor users without additional protection. The creature population is shaped by 2 centuries of the most intense ambient radiation in the region, and the desolation is total. Certain quest lines require the player to cross it. The crossing is not comfortable. Fallout 76's Appalachia is centered on West Virginia, the mountains, the forests, the river valleys, and the specific character of a region that was economically marginal even before the war. The Greenbrier, a real luxury resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, which had an actual government continuity bunker beneath it, appears in the game as White Spring, maintaining its bunker operations. Mount Blair Terraformer, a reference to the massive surface mining operations of the real West Virginia coal industry, stands as a significant location in the game's landscape. The Mothman, a piece of genuine West Virginia folklore originating in Point Pleasant's 1966-67 sightings, appears as an actual game creature. The Amazon television series is set across multiple locations, primarily Los Angeles. Both the pre-war city in flashback sequences and the post-war ruins of it in present-day action, and the Vault 33, 32, and 31 complex in California, as well as the NCR territory and the emerging political landscape of the West Coast. The show's production design team spent significant time on the pre-war sequences, building a version of Los Angeles that extends the franchise's 1950s aesthetic into a city whose actual mid-century character is well documented in photographs and film. The result feels continuous with what the games established, rather than simply borrowed from it. Each of these regions, in the games and in the show, is specific. The Commonwealth does not feel like the Mojave. The Capital Wasteland does not feel like Appalachia. The franchise's commitment to geographic specificity, to making the ruins of each place feel like the ruins of that particular place, rather than generic post-apocalyptic landscape, is one of its sustained artistic achievements. Part 13, The Religions of the Wasteland. 2 centuries of chaos produce new institutions, and among the institutions that emerge reliably from social collapse are religions. Fallout's Wasteland has generated several, each one shaped by the specific conditions and materials available to the community that built it. The Church of Adam, more commonly called the Children of Adam, is the franchise's most developed religious organization. They appear in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, Fallout, New Vegas, and the Amazon series. Their theology is constructed around nuclear fission as a divine principle. The splitting of the atom is understood as the act of creation, the Great War as a form of divine revelation, radiation as sacred and purifying, and the ongoing transformation of irradiated environments as evidence of divine process. Members who have been exposed to significant radiation for extended periods develop radiation-related health changes, which they interpret as marks of divine favor. Some long-term children display symptoms consistent with high-dose radiation exposure and are considered holier for it. The specific genius of the Children of Adam as a fictional religion is that their theology is responsive to their actual conditions in a way that real religious traditions often are. They live in a world saturated with radiation. Standard human biology treats radiation as toxic. The children reframe radiation as holy. They encounter evidence of atomic destruction everywhere they travel. They reframe destruction as revelation. The Great War, which killed hundreds of millions of people, becomes in their reading an act of divine grace. The logic is internally consistent within its own premises, which is more than can be said for the theology of many fictional religions. The atom itself is, in their doctrine, a divine being or perhaps the physical expression of a divine principle. Different sects of the children emphasize different aspects of the theology. The nucleus, the children's settlement in the island DLC of Fallout 4, is commanded by a high confessor who has developed the theology in directions that are both more elaborate and more extreme than the base game version. The player can interact with this community at length, and the writers committed fully to making the children's theology coherent and their community believable as a place where people actually live and find meaning. Underworld in Fallout 3 is a settlement of ghouls in the ruins of the Museum of Natural History, beneath a large diorama of a natural scene in the museum's entrance hall. The ghoul residents have developed something not quite a religion, but approaching it a philosophical framework organized around the specific experience of being something that looked human once and does not anymore, of having watched the world from which they came fall apart, of being widely reviled by other wasteland populations. The community's relationship with its own past is its primary spiritual content. The followers of the apocalypse in California and Nevada operate on what is essentially secular humanist principles: knowledge, medical care, and support for anyone in need, regardless of other affiliations. They are the inverse of a religion. They have an ethics without a metaphysics, a community without a theology. Their commitment to treating the sick regardless of faction affiliation has kept them alive in environments where other factions have tried and occasionally succeeded in eliminating them. The Brotherhood of Steel has been described repeatedly as operating like a religious order, and the structural parallel is deliberate. They have a founding myth organized around Roger Maxon's decision, the moment of creation, when a man refused to participate in something he knew was wrong and walked his people into the desert to build something different. They have hierarchy that resembles religious hierarchy: initiates, knights, paladins, elders, high elder. They have doctrine that prescribes behavior toward technology, toward outsiders, toward their own mission. They have a relationship with knowledge that is curatorial rather than simply practical. They preserve things because preserving them is right, not simply because the things are useful. What they do not have is transcendence, and this produces the specific quality of moral crisis that recurs throughout the franchise's engagement with the Brotherhood. An organization that has decided it is the custodian of all that is worth keeping, but has no principle beyond itself that tells it what keeping something is actually for, is an organization that can become cruel in the precise service of its stated values. The Lions Brotherhood in Fallout 3 is what happens when someone asks what the technology is for and decides to use it to help people. The Elder Maxon Brotherhood in Fallout 4 is what happens when the question of purpose is answered by the mandate itself. The Rust Devils, the Rust Angels, the Church of the Glow, the various unnamed cult-like factions encountered in wasteland settlements across multiple games, they all represent the same basic dynamic. People building frameworks of meaning from what is available in the ruins, trying to make the specific and terrible conditions of their existence legible within some larger structure. The wasteland does not produce nihilism as reliably as fiction might suggest. It produces theology, because theology is what humans use to make sense of conditions that exceed ordinary comprehension. Part 14. The Economy of Bottle Caps and Barter. The economies of the Fallout wasteland are decentralized, region-specific, and shaped by local scarcity in ways that a pre-war economist would find either fascinating or alarming. Bottle caps function as the primary currency across most of the franchise's geographic scope, but the specific reasons they function and the ways they are supplemented or replaced by other systems in different regions reveal a great deal about how economic order re-emerges from collapse. The adoption of bottle caps as currency happened organically across multiple wasteland communities through a process that each franchise entry has documented slightly differently. The consistent thread is that bottle caps were the right size, weight, and durability for the purpose, and were widely distributed enough that most people had encountered them before the war ended. Their production required equipment no surviving faction initially possessed the machinery for stamping metal into specific shapes with specific markings. This production difficulty gave them the essential property of a viable currency. They could not be easily counterfeited or inflated without significant industrial capacity. In Fallout 1 and 2, hub merchants operating out of the major trading city of the hub in Southern California gave bottle caps a formal backing by agreeing to exchange them for water. The hub's water merchants were the largest water distributors in the region, and their agreement to treat caps as a claim on a specific quantity of water gave the currency a commodity anchor that made it economically coherent. Merchants far from the hub accepted caps partly on the faith that the hub's backing remained in place, and the backing remained in place partly because enough merchants had adopted the caps that abandoning them would have been more disruptive than maintaining them. The NCR eventually created paper currency backed by water reserves, a more sophisticated monetary system that allowed the Republic's economy to function at larger scales than a commodity metal currency could easily support. The transition was not universally welcomed. Merchants and traders who had managed cap-based systems for decades found the NCR's paper money less familiar and less universally accepted. Outside NCR territory, paper money was useful only as kindling, which is the wasteland's assessment of any currency whose value depends entirely on institutional trust in a specific government. Barter remains the foundation beneath all the formal currency systems. In settlements too small or too isolated for currency to be practically maintained, direct exchange is the rule. A working water purifier chip is worth more than any currency if the person who has clean water to sell wants something specific that only the trader has. Medical supplies command premium prices everywhere because production capacity for most pharmaceutical categories does not exist. Pre-war technology in working condition is worth whatever the person who needs it most is willing to pay, which often turns out to be quite a lot. Scrap is a category of economic material unique to the post-war world. The ruins of pre-war civilization contain an enormous quantity of manufactured goods, electronics, vehicles, household appliances, construction materials that have been sitting in varying stages of deterioration for 2 centuries. Some of this material retains its original function. More of it has deteriorated past functionality but remains as raw material. Metal, glass, ceramic, rubber. Fallout 4's crafting system makes this explicit. Everything that appears as junk in the wasteland is, at its base, a supply of component materials for fabrication. The economy of scrap is the economy that makes improvised weapons, settlement construction, and improvisational technology possible. The weapons traders of the Wasteland Gunrunners in California, Rivet City arms dealers in the Capital Wasteland, the various merchants who operate supply runs between major settlements function in an economic niche that would not have existed in the pre-war world in the same form. They do not manufacture most of what they sell. They refurbish, repair, and redistribute weapons that already existed before the war, maintaining them through knowledge of pre-war mechanical systems that is itself a scarce and valuable commodity. Energy cells, fusion cores, and plasma cartridges occupy a peculiar position in the wasteland economy. They are the fuel for the more sophisticated weapons and equipment. They were manufactured in quantities large enough that they have not run out in 2 centuries, but in quantities small enough that they are always worth trading for. A functioning fusion core capable of powering a suit of power armor for an extended period is a significant economic asset. A settlement that controls access to stockpiled fusion cores controls access to the most capable form of individual military equipment in most of the game's settings. The economics of slavery exist throughout the franchise and are engaged with at different levels of directness depending on the game. Caesar's Legion maintains a slave economy that is explicitly mapped onto Roman practices. The Pit, a DLC area in Fallout 3 set in the ruins of Pittsburgh, is organized around a slave labor system controlled by the Raider faction that runs the steel mill. The economic argument for slavery in the Pit is made explicit. Steel production requires labor, the labor is dangerous enough that workers die in significant numbers, and the only way to maintain production is to continuously replenish the labor supply from the outside. This is not presented as anything other than terrible. It is presented as the terrible solution that an isolated community with a specific economic structure arrived at, which is a different thing. Part 15. The Super Mutants: A Deeper Look. Super Mutants deserve more attention than most game guides give them, because the franchise has spent significant time across multiple entries examining what it actually means to be one. The forced evolutionary virus produces different results depending on the strain used, the method of exposure, and the individual physiology of the subject. The West Coast strains used at Mariposa and by the Master produce the large, green, cognitively reduced super mutants of the first 2 games in Fallout 2. The Capital Wasteland strains, used in Vault 87, produce a different variant, slightly bluish-gray, larger even than their West Coast counterparts, with deterioration progressing more rapidly. East Coast super mutants grow even larger and more physically degraded over time. Elders of the Capital Wasteland type eventually become behemoths, creatures so large and so far from any human template that the original form is effectively unrecognizable. The Appalachian strains in Fallout 76 behave differently still, because the transformation happened earlier in the timeline, and the FEV in that region had not undergone the same refinement processes. The super mutants of Appalachia are contemporaneous with the bombs falling. They are some of the first super mutants, turned within years of 2077 rather than decades afterward. What the Master understood, and what remained true through all subsequent super mutant populations, is that the transformation produces sterility universally. There are no half-super mutants. There are no super mutant children. Every super mutant who exists was once a human being who was subjected to FEV exposure. The continuity of the species depends entirely on converting more humans. The Master's army was literally cannibalizing the only source of future soldiers it had. Strong in Fallout 4 is a companion character who is a super mutant actively searching for a story he calls the Milk of Human Kindness, which he encountered as a phrase in a copy of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and which he interpreted as a description of a specific substance that would make super mutants stronger. His quest is entirely sincere. His interpretation is, from a human literary standpoint, completely incorrect. His running commentary on human behavior throughout the game is consistently dissonant in ways that produce both comedy and something close to pathos. He is trying to understand a world he was not originally part of, using the cognitive tools available to him, which are significant in quantity but not well matched to the task. Marcus in Fallout 2 and New Vegas is the franchise's most fully developed super mutant character, a former soldier from the Master's army who survived the Master's defeat, settled into the changed world, and has been living as a community member in different settlements for decades. His perspective on the super mutant condition is philosophical in ways that Strong's is not. He has thought carefully about what it means to be part of a population that cannot sustain itself naturally, that is broadly feared and hated, and that represents in physical form the consequences of exactly the kind of unchecked scientific program that produced the Wasteland's other catastrophes. Marcus has opinions. He has reached conclusions. Some of them are about the nature of hope. The super mutant community in Broken Hills, the settlement Marcus co-founded with the Brotherhood paladin Jacob, represents the franchise's most direct experiment with integration. The community had humans, ghouls, and super mutants living and working together, held together partly by the specific personalities of its founders, and partly by the economic reality that all three populations needed the uranium mine that the settlement was built around to function. The experiment ended when the human population and the super mutant population's tensions became irresolvable. The ghouls mostly left when it became clear that neither side was going to be persuaded by the presence of a third party that had its own grievances. The question the franchise consistently circles around super mutants is, what is owed to a population that was created by atrocity? The people who became super mutants did not choose to. The FEV was applied to them by others' military programs, the Master's agents, Vault-Tec experiments. What emerged is a population that is widely reviled for its appearance and behavior, that cannot biologically sustain itself without committing the same kind of violence that was committed on them, and that in its more cognitively intact individuals is capable of understanding all of this. The franchise does not answer the question. It just keeps asking it, from different angles, across different games and different characters. Part 16. Power Armor and Engineering History. Power armor in the Fallout universe has a development history that mirrors, in its outline, the trajectory of many military technologies: need, research, prototype, deployment, refinement, and then, the moment the civilization that built it stops being able to maintain it. The T-45 model was the earliest power armor to reach mass production. It was developed under wartime pressure for the Alaskan front, where conventional soldiers equipped with conventional gear were at a decisive disadvantage in direct combat with Chinese forces, who had their own equivalent equipment programs and numerical advantages. The T-45 was rushed through development faster than optimal engineers who would later work on the T-51. B noted that the T-45 had structural weaknesses they had identified during testing that were overridden by the production schedule. It was better than nothing, which was the relevant comparison at the time. The T-51B, developed over subsequent years with the benefit of operational experience with the T-45, was considered by military assessments to be the finest personal protective equipment ever produced. It incorporated better joint work, improved radiation shielding, a better life support integration, and combat performance metrics that consistently exceeded the T-45 across nearly all engagement categories. By 2077, it represented the highest standard of personal military equipment available to any force anywhere in the world. The X-1 power armor, developed in the final months before the Great War specifically for Enclave operatives, represents the last and most advanced stage of pre-war power armor engineering. Its development documentation appears in terminal entries across the games, a project conducted with full awareness of the deteriorating strategic situation, intended to provide the Enclave's core operatives with an advantage over the military forces they might eventually face. The X-1 did not reach wide deployment before the bombs fell, which is why it is rare in the post-war world. Fallout 4 introduced a change to how power armor functioned mechanically in the games that represented a significant design shift. In previous Bethesda-era games, power armor was treated essentially as heavy clothing it could be put on and taken off freely and weighed nothing in inventory. In Fallout 4, power armor became a vehicle, a large mechanical frame that the player character physically enters and exits, that requires fusion cores to run, and that has individual components which can be damaged, repaired, and upgraded independently. The frames exist separately from the armor components. A frame without components is still a working exoskeleton. A full set of components without a frame is a pile of parts. The distinction changes how players interact with the equipment significantly. The Brotherhood of Steel in every regional chapter has organized much of its activity around acquiring and maintaining power armor. Their scribes have developed the expertise to repair and upgrade suits that have been in continuous use for decades or centuries. Their paladins and knights are the primary users. Their chapter facilities include dedicated maintenance bays. The relationship between the Brotherhood and power armor is institutional. They are an organization built partly on the premise that they are the people qualified to use this equipment, which means they are also the people responsible for its conservation and for ensuring it does not fall into the hands of people they consider unqualified. The Institute in Fallout 4 has developed its own Variant X3 prototypes visible in certain areas of the Institute's facilities, representing what post-war scientific advancement looks like when given access to a well-resourced laboratory and 2 centuries of time. The Enclave in Fallout 3 uses X1 variants. The Brotherhood in Fallout 4 uses T-60, a model developed after the war from T-51B materials. The landscape of power armor in any given game is a map of which pre-war programs whose operators survive to develop them further. The fusion core requirement introduced in Fallout 4 is, in the lore, a reflection of the same problem that affects most advanced pre-war technology. It requires manufactured components to operate, and manufacturing capacity has been compromised for 2 centuries. Fusion cores were produced in enormous quantities before the war, and stockpiled extensively, which is why they are still findable throughout the Commonwealth. But the supply is finite in a way that was not true before 2077. Eventually, not in the game's timeframes, but eventually there will be no more fusion cores, and power armor frames will be excellent but very heavy suits of metal with no power system. Part 17. The Radio Stations of the Wasteland. Radio is the medium of the Fallout wasteland in a way that no other communication technology has become. There is internet-equivalent technology in the Fallout universe, called the pre-war net, but it effectively ceased to exist when the infrastructure that supported it was bombed. Radio towers require a transmitter, a power source, and a person, and in the post-war world, all 3 of those are more achievable than a distributed digital network. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is the most developed radio presence in the franchise because it operates as a narrative device as well as a music delivery system. Three Dog is aware of what the player is doing not in any supernatural sense, but in the sense that news travels in the capital wasteland, and a man who has been paying attention to the wasteland for years knows who to ask about what. His commentary updates as the player completes significant questline milestones. He describes the Lone Wanderer's actions in terms that are part factual reporting and part mythology building, treating the player character as a figure who is becoming legendary in real time. This creates an unusual relationship between the player and the narrative. Normally in games, the player character's significance is conveyed through cutscenes, dialogue, and the behavior of NPCs toward them. In Fallout 3, the player's significance is also broadcast literally transmitted across the capital wasteland on a radio frequency that anyone with a receiver can access. There is a version of you being created by Three Dog, and you can listen to it while you are doing the things it describes. The gap between Three Dog's interpretation and what actually happened is, in the best moments, funny in a way that has something true in it about how reputation works. Mojave Music Radio in Fallout New Vegas has no host. It simply plays music, a broad selection from the pre-war catalog, uninterrupted by commentary. This absence is itself a characterization of the Mojave Wasteland, a place that has been surviving for long enough that the commentary on surviving is less necessary than it was in the capital wasteland in Fallout 3. The Mojave has its own voice, distributed across the voices of Mr. New Vegas on radio, New Vegas and the music, and the general quality of a region that has been doing this long enough to have developed its own culture. Radio New Vegas is hosted by Mr. New Vegas, voiced by Wayne Newton. Mr. New Vegas is cheerful in a specific radio voice way, professional and warm, operating without apparent awareness that the city he is broadcasting from is the center of a political and military conflict. His programming includes news, music, and announcements delivered in the same smooth cadence regardless of what the news actually contains. He reports on factional conflict and potential war with the same pleasant tone he uses to introduce a Dean Martin record. There is something in this that functions as a commentary on pre-war American media. The world was ending, and the radio kept being pleasant about it. Emerald Ranch Radio in Fallout 76 serves Appalachia, playing music and period-appropriate content into a landscape that is, for most of the game's launch period, completely devoid of other surviving human characters. The human characters in Appalachia at the time of the game's story have all died. The player is exploring a world in which the humans they encounter are dead in terminals, in recordings, in the audio logs that document the period between the bombs and the present. The radio plays music into this context. The contrast between the warmth of the music and the emptiness it plays into is, depending on your mood when you encounter it, either deeply sad or strangely comforting. Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4 is hosted by Travis Miles, introduced as an exceptionally nervous man whose broadcasting style is shaky, self-deprecating, and frequently disrupted by his own self-consciousness. His on-air persona at the beginning of the game is immediately recognizable as someone in the wrong job, doing their best with limited internal resources. A questline exists in which the player can help Travis develop confidence, and the in-game broadcasts shift noticeably as a result. His delivery becomes smoother, his commentary more assured, the station more like what a professional radio host sounds like. The change is, for a minor questline in a large game, affecting. A man got better at his job. The radio sounds different. The city is slightly different for having better music in it. The pirate radio in some games, unlicensed transmitters operated by the railroad in Fallout 4 as part of their communication infrastructure, for example, represents a different layer of the wasteland's radio landscape. Radio as covert communication, as resistance infrastructure, as the means by which information travels between people who cannot afford to travel in person or send messages through channels others might intercept. The radio tower, as a contested military and political asset, runs through multiple games. Part 18. Ghouls Through the Ages. The ghoul community of the Fallout universe has, over the course of the franchise, accumulated a history that is internally consistent and, when considered in its full extent, genuinely melancholy in ways that the surface-level horror elements associated with feral ghouls do not prepare most players to encounter. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is a ghoul who wants to live in Tenpenny Tower, the luxury high-rise that serves as a functioning preserved residence for wealthy surface dwellers in the capital wasteland. He has been refused because the human residents of Tenpenny Tower do not want ghoul neighbors. The player can resolve the situation in multiple ways. They can broker a settlement in which the ghouls are admitted as residents, which the game systems will eventually reveal to have been a catastrophic choice the feral ghouls that Roy brought with him. Without the player's knowledge, kill the human residents. They can choose to kill Roy and his followers. They can do nothing and leave the conflict unresolved. There is no version of this quest that does not have something terrible in it, which is the design intent, discrimination, integration, and the consequences of good intentions inadequately examined are not problems with clean solutions. Raul Tejada in New Vegas is one of the franchise's most elegantly constructed companion characters. He is a centuries-old ghoul who has survived in the pre-war world as an auto mechanic, was taken hostage by a raider gang operating out of a radio tower, and joins the player after being rescued. His personal questline involves examining whether his age, his centuries of accumulated experience, of watching everything he built and everyone he cared about eventually be destroyed, has produced wisdom or simply fatigue, and whether those two things can coexist. He was a gunslinger before he was a mechanic. He had a family in Mexico before the bombs. He watched them die in the years after the war. The player can, through his personal quest, help him decide whether to take up the gun again or put it down for good. Both choices are valid. Neither is entirely satisfying. Jason Bright in Fallout. New Vegas is the leader of a ghoul community called RepCon, occupying a former rocket testing facility north of New Vegas. He believes that his community is destined for the great journey, a voyage to the far beyond, which is to say, space. He has a religious framework organized around his community's survival and their eventual departure from the world that has repeatedly demonstrated it does not want them in it. The player can help this journey succeed. Bright and his congregation launch rockets and are gone, and their destination is not shown, and the game lets you imagine that they found what they were looking for. There is a particular category of ghoul character that appears across several games. The person who was ordinary before the war, and who has been in the wasteland long enough to have processed most of what that means, and who has arrived at a kind of equilibrium that is not happiness exactly, but is sustainable. These characters speak about the pre-war world with the specific tone of someone describing a memory that is still sharp but no longer produces grief in the same acute way, not because the grief was resolved, but because grief maintained at full intensity for 2 centuries costs too much, and the mind finds ways to carry it differently. The ghouls in Underworld and Fallout 3 have built what is, in many ways, the most civilized community in the Capital Wasteland. Their settlement is in a museum of natural history. They have maintained the museum's collection, or significant portions of it. They have a bar, they have commerce, they have a doctor. The Ninth Circle is a bar run by a ghoul named Azrukal, who is quietly one of the most sinister characters in the game, but sinister in the particular way of someone who has decided that enlightened self-interest is the only rational position available to someone of his age and experience. He employs a companion character named Karen, through a contract arrangement that is the game's way of commenting on what economic desperation looks like when you have no legal recourse and no other options. The player can break this contract. They are not told to. The game trusts them to notice and decide. The children of Adam have, in their theology, given ghouls a specific status. Ghouls who join the children are understood as individuals who have been touched by Adam, who have undergone a partial transformation that demonstrates divine favor. The feralization of ghouls, in Children of Adam doctrine, is not tragedy but transition. The feral ghoul has moved beyond individual consciousness into a purer relationship with the divine principle of radiation. This is a theology that works, from the inside, in the same way that all theological frameworks work when suffering is real, and the options for making it legible are limited. Part 19. Crafting, Settlement, and the Meaning of Building. Fallout 4 introduced a settlement building system that allowed the player to construct structures, furniture, lighting, defenses, crops, and essentially functioning small towns from available materials. The decision to include this system was the product of a specific observation about what players were already doing. They were using every available in-game system to create spaces that felt like home. They were choosing settlements to return to. They were organizing storage. They were arranging things. The settlement system made this explicit and gave it mechanical weight. A settlement needs food, water, power, and beds. It needs defenses against attacks. It can be connected to other settlements through supply lines that share resources. NPCs can be recruited to live in it. A radio beacon can be built to attract new settlers. The player character is simultaneously the most capable military force in most of the Commonwealth situations, and the person responsible for the infrastructure planning of a small agricultural community. Both roles are real. Neither is more important than the other, according to the game's values. The materials for construction come from scrap. Everything in the world that functions as a junk item: tin cans, typewriters, desk fans, microscopes, telephone handsets, clocks. Pre-war money has component materials that can be extracted and used in fabrication. This produces a specific behavior in players who have absorbed the system. They stop seeing the world as a landscape of abandoned objects and start seeing it as a distributed supply of aluminum, steel, ceramic, copper, and rubber. The pre-war civilization's output becomes raw material for what comes after it. The ruined parking lot and the collapsed retail storefront and the scavenged suburban house are not just scenery, they are inventory. Castle Nuka, Spectacle Island, the County Crossing Settlement, the quarry on the edge of the map, each of these is a place that can be converted into a functioning community, and the conversion is the player's project as much as any questline. The settlement system was polarizing among players who had preferred the relatively uncluttered experience of earlier Fallout games, but it was designed from a genuine understanding of what post-apocalyptic fiction is fundamentally about. Not the collapse, but the rebuilding. The sole survivor in Fallout 4 is, unlike the player characters of previous games, a person with a specific pre-war identity and a specific personal catastrophe. They were a professional before the war, a lawyer, or a soldier, depending on gender selection. They had a spouse and a child. They entered Vault 111 and were cryogenically frozen. 2 centuries later, they emerged to find their spouse murdered and their child gone. The settlement system, in this reading, is not separate from the narrative. It is the player's response to it. The character who lost everything is building, because building is what you do when the alternative is despair. The Minutemen, the faction the player most directly builds through the settlement system, are the franchise's most explicit statement about the value of local organization. They are not a military force with a doctrine about technology or a philosophy about governance. They are a mutual aid organization. Communities help each other, and when communities are threatened, people with guns respond. The Minutemen were nearly destroyed before the game begins because the communities they served stopped trusting them after a series of failures. Building them back is building back the trust, which requires proving repeatedly that the commitment to help is real, not contingent. Part 20. The Faces of Evil. The franchise's antagonists. Fallout has produced some of the most memorable antagonists in the role-playing genre, and they are memorable for a specific reason. They are, almost universally, right about something important. The disagreement is not between someone correct and someone incorrect. It is between competing visions of what correctly responding to the same real problem looks like. The Master is the clearest example. Richard Gray was a scientist. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time and fell into a vat of the most consequential biological substance in the franchise's lore. What emerged from that vat had inherited Gray's intelligence, his genuine horror at what the Great War had produced, and his desperation to find a solution. His solution, forced transformation of humanity into super mutants, which he genuinely believed were a superior survival form that would outlast the wasteland's challenges, is eugenics implemented with biological technology. It is monstrous. It is also, from his perspective, based on a real problem. Human beings in the wasteland are struggling to survive, and struggle is familiar territory for the Master after what he went through. The defeat comes not from the player outfighting him or outmaneuvering him, but from demonstrating through argument that his plan is biologically impossible. He thought he was saving the species. He was ending it. Legate Lanius, Caesar's field commander in New Vegas, is a different kind of antagonist, not a tragic visionary, but a constructed weapon. He is a man who was systematically stripped of everything that was not military effectiveness, and what remained has been pointed at an objective. Caesar assembled him for a purpose. He serves that purpose efficiently. In a direct confrontation that the player can force through certain choices, he can be argued out of his attack on the Hoover Dam, presented with the argument that the Legion's supply lines are overextended and that victory at the dam would produce a position that collapsed under its own logistics. This is not an appeal to conscience. It is a military assessment that Lanius himself recognizes as valid. He withdraws. A general who makes tactically sound decisions is not, the game implies, necessarily a moral agent. The Institute, throughout most of Fallout 4's main questline, is presented as the most existential threat in the Commonwealth through reputation rather than demonstrated action. The Institute kidnaps people and replaces them with synths. The Institute conducts experiments. The Institute is responsible for the social paranoia that runs through every Commonwealth settlement, the constant whispered fear that anyone might be a synth, which is functionally identical to the paranoid social dynamics of McCarthyism, of which the 1950s aesthetic is partly a commentary. When the player reaches the Institute and speaks to its director, who turns out to be their own child, aged 2 centuries through life extension technology, the picture complicates. The Institute's members are conducting genuine research. They believe they are working toward a better future. They have decided that engaging with the surface world's existing power structures is less productive than building something better beneath it. The question of whether their ends justify their means is one the game asks directly through the faction choice the player makes. Colonel Autumn in Fallout 3 occupies a slightly different structural position. He is the antagonist who is wrong about what he is doing and knows it and has decided to keep doing it anyway, which in some ways is the most disturbing category. He serves the Enclave under President Eden, believing that the Enclave's brutal solution to the post-war population, the FEV contamination of the water supply, to eliminate anyone not of sufficiently pure genetic stock, meaning anyone who has any mutation whatsoever from radiation exposure, is going too far and pursuing it anyway because his alternative is to stop being part of an institution he has built his entire identity around. People who know they are doing the wrong thing and continue are more frightening than people who believe they are doing the right thing. Father Elijah in the Dead Money DLC of New Vegas is the franchise's clearest portrait of intelligence consuming itself. A former Brotherhood of Steel elder, one of the Western chapter's most brilliant researchers, he became obsessed with the Sierra Madre Casino, a pre-war entertainment complex that was never opened and that contained in its vaults enough technology to reshape the post-war world. He is capable of sophisticated, technical, and strategic thinking. He has thought carefully about what he wants and how to get it. What he wants is to lock the world outside the Sierra Madre and watch it rot, alone in his cache of pre-war wonders. The DLC is structured as a heist. The other characters are, against their will, his tools. He intends to kill them when he is done with them. The ending, where the player traps him in the Sierra Madre's vault, alone with the treasure he has done terrible things to reach, has become one of the franchise's most discussed narrative moments. It is not satisfying in the way of conventional villain defeat. It is the specific hollow satisfaction of watching someone achieve exactly what they wanted and understanding that what they wanted was never going to make them less broken. Part 21. Hidden Histories: What Terminal Logs Tell Us. One of the franchise's most distinctive narrative strategies is the use of terminal logs, written records found on pre-war and post-war computers to deliver stories that happen entirely in the past without any of the conventional present-tense drama that surrounds them. Terminal logs are written accounts of events that have already concluded. The people who wrote them are, in virtually every case, dead. Sometimes they died before the war ended. Sometimes they died in the war. Sometimes they survived the war and built a life in the post-war world and died decades or centuries later. The player reading their words is reading primary source documentation of the world that ended. It is a form of archaeology. The terminal entries in Vault 92, a vault in Fallout 3 designed to study whether subliminal audio could be used to make musicians, a population hypothesized to have specific neurological profiles into unstoppable killing machines, document a controlled experiment that went out of control in very specific ways. The researchers documented what was happening from inside the experiment. The residents did not know they were subjects. The researchers knew they were recording the consequences of what they had done, and they kept recording anyway, because the data was the point. The vault's current state, when the player arrives, is the result of this documented process. The terminal entries in Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 document a mining operation that encountered something that should not have been underground. The entries begin as routine operational records, shift reports, equipment maintenance logs, production targets. They change. A foreman begins behaving unusually. Workers report hearing things. The entries become fragmentary. What they encountered at the bottom of the borehole is not named and is not shown directly. The evidence is in the documentation of how people responded to it. Horror in these entries is delivered through the administrative language of people trying to maintain professional composure while something has gone fundamentally wrong. The terminal entries in the Hallucinogen building in Fallout 4, where a pharmaceutical company was testing airborne hallucinogenic compounds on unknowing test subjects in the area surrounding its facility, document the disconnect between what the research team knew they were doing and how they described it. The language is corporate test subjects, exposure parameters, neurological response metrics applied to accounts of what they were, in plain language, doing to the people who walked past their building. The gap between the language and the reality is not accidental. The Fallout universe's institutional language always maintains its professional register regardless of what the institution is actually doing, because maintaining professional register is how institutions continue to function past the point when they should stop. The personal journals are the most emotionally direct entries. A woman in a shelter in the Capital Wasteland wrote daily entries for 200 days after the bombs fell, documenting the slow deterioration of the group's resources and social cohesion. Her entries become shorter as her situation worsens. The last entry is very brief. The player finds the journal in a space that makes the last entry's context clear without stating it. Researchers in the Institute documented their own gradual loss of connection to the surface world's reality, not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of small choices, each rational in isolation, to prioritize the Institute's research agenda over the well-being of the people the research affected. They are not monsters, these researchers. They are scientists who stopped thinking of the people they were experimenting on as the same kind of beings they were. This process is documented in their own words, which makes it more disturbing than any externally rendered villainy would be. The terminal at Vault 81, where the original researcher documents her decision to sabotage the pharmaceutical program, is one of the franchise's most important single pieces of writing. It is a record of a moral decision made in isolation, without any guarantee of support or recognition. She destroyed years of research that she had herself conducted. She did this because she concluded that what she was doing was wrong. The terminal entry is the only record of the decision. She left no other memorial. The player finds it 2 centuries later and reads a person being, briefly, good. Part 22. Endings and what they mean. Fallout has a specific relationship with its endings. The franchise tends to resist the conventional satisfying conclusion the moment when good has clearly won, evil has been defeated, and the world is measurably better than it was when the story began. Its endings are usually more ambivalent than this, and the ambivalence is part of the design. The ending of the original Fallout, in which the Vault Dweller defeats the Master, destroys Mariposa, and returns to Vault 13 where they are exiled because the Vault's overseer has decided that someone who has seen the outside world cannot be allowed to stay, is one of the most memorable endings in role-playing game history for being genuinely unjust. The player has done everything right. They have saved the people who cannot save themselves, and the community they saved has decided they are too dangerous to remain. The protagonist walks out into the wasteland alone. The credits roll over their footsteps on the road. The ending of Fallout 2, which is more elaborate and gives each major faction and character a brief postscript in text-over-image format, performs the same function in aggregate that the first game's ending performed for one character. It shows what happened after, and what happened after is not uniformly positive. Some things got better, some things got worse. The world the Chosen One saved continues to be the world it is, complicated and ongoing and not yet resolved. Fallout. New Vegas has, at a rough count, over 20 distinct endings, depending on the combination of questline outcomes the player achieves, and every major ending is represented through a narrator voiced by Ron Perlman, who has opened every mainline Fallout game's ending narration with war. War never changes. Reading the postscript for each faction and significant location. The tone of these endings is consistently matter-of-fact about good news and bad news alike. Victory for one faction in the Mojave means something specific for each community within it. The Yes Man ending, in which the player has built an independent New Vegas without the NCR or the Legion or Mr. House, ends not with triumph but with a quiet acknowledgement that running a city-state in the post-nuclear Mojave is a problem that does not stop having new dimensions. The ending of Fallout 3 was, on initial release, one of the most discussed in gaming for a specific reason. The main character had to die. The endgame required someone to enter a radiation-saturated chamber and activate the purifier. The game would not allow any companion to do it in the player's place. Players who had taken the perk that made them immune to radiation damage were also required to go in, which produced a logical inconsistency in the narrative that was resolved in the Broken Steel DLC, which extended the game past the original ending and gave the player the option of sending the radiation-immune companion Fox in their place, or the ghoul companion Sharon. The original ending's insistence that the player's character must die was, developers noted, a narrative choice about sacrifice. Whether that choice was correct was debated. Fallout 4 has 4 major endings depending on which faction the player aligns with, and it is by some metrics the Fallout game with the most endings that feel genuinely ambivalent about their own content. Siding with the Brotherhood and destroying the Institute means destroying a generation of scientists who, whatever their methods, represent the last significant research institution in the region. Siding with the Institute and destroying the Brotherhood means destroying an organization that, whatever its methods, provides military stability. Siding with the Railroad and destroying both means prioritizing synthetic liberation over every other consideration. The Minutemen ending preserves the most factions and resolves the least. The Institute must still be destroyed, but the rest of the Commonwealth's political landscape continues to have space in it. No ending is obviously correct. All of them leave something behind that deserved better. Part 23. Nuka World and the Question of Villainy. The Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4 is the franchise's most explicit experiment with placing the player in the role of an actual villain. Not a morally complex figure navigating complicated choices, but someone who leads raider gangs, establishes extortion rackets in settlements, and forces communities that trusted the Minutemen to pay tribute. Nuka World is a pre-war theme park, a vast entertainment complex organized around the Nuka-Cola brand, with multiple themed areas and a monorail system. The attraction, in the post-war world, has become the territory of three raider factions: the operators, businesslike and profit-motivated; the pack, theatrical and animalistic in their aesthetic; and the disciples, whose relationship to violence is more directly personal and therefore more alarming. Together they call themselves the Overboss's gangs, and the player character is the new Overboss, having won the title through combat. The decision to give the player a choice here: raid the Commonwealth and use the raiders to establish tribute networks in Minutemen settlements, or turn on the raider factions, is the DLC's central design statement. The turn on the raiders path requires violence against people the player has spent the DLC building relationships with. The raiding path requires doing genuinely terrible things to settlements the player may have previously built and cared about. Both paths are available. Neither is made comfortable. The faction leaders are written with enough individual texture that engaging with the raiding path feels specific rather than generically evil. Gage, the companion for this DLC, has been managing raider politics at Nuka World for years and is pragmatic about the moral dimensions of what he does in a way that is honest about its own bleakness. He has thought about whether what he does is right and concluded that the relevant question is whether he can survive it. He is not unaware. He has just decided that awareness costs more than it returns. The theme park environment produces a specific quality of dissonance. Nuka-Cola advertising cheerful, bright, designed for children and families survives throughout the facility in pristine condition because the pre-war corporation maintained the installation until the bombs fell. Wandering through zones that were designed to be maximally pleasant and discovering that they are now organized around three gangs' territorial disputes produces the particular fallout note of encountering the cheerfulness of a dead civilization in a context that illuminates why it was hollow. Part 24. What the franchise has said about America. Fallout is, underneath its science fiction and its horror and its role-playing mechanics, a sustained piece of commentary about America. This is not subtext. Tim Kaine has said so. Josh Sawyer has said so. The creative teams across multiple studios have said so. The franchise is a thought experiment about American optimism, American violence, American capitalism, and American military power, conducted through the device of imagining what would happen if all of those things were carried to their logical conclusions, and then had a nuclear exchange. The 1950s aesthetic is not mere nostalgia. It is a specific historical moment: the post-World War II American confidence, the belief that technology would make everything better, the certainty that American prosperity was both deserved and sustainable, the specific quality of optimism that had not yet encountered the cultural and political upheavals of the following decade. The Fallout universe extended that moment into the future and asked what it looks like from the ruins. The corporations of the pre-war world, Vault-Tec, Robco, General Atomics, Westech, Nuka-Cola Corporation, are American corporations that have extended their operations beyond any normal regulatory framework and have been engaging in behavior that, if documented in our history, would constitute crimes against humanity on a significant scale. Vault-Tec used its shelter contracts to conduct human experimentation without consent. Westech developed biological weapons and tested them on prisoners of war. General Atomics built robotic workers that displaced human labor and then refused to acknowledge any responsibility for the social consequences. The Nuka-Cola Corporation added radioactive isotopes to a beverage without disclosing this to consumers. None of these things, in the Fallout universe, produced meaningful accountability before the bombs fell, because the government that would have provided accountability was invested in the same projects and the same corporations. The war itself, the Sino-American War over resource access, is the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of what American military power ultimately serves. The resource wars produced Canada's annexation, Alaskan operations, biological weapons development, and an escalation of nuclear readiness posture that the technology eventually expressed. The great power conflict that ended in nuclear exchange was not an anomaly that arose from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of choices, each one justifiable in its immediate context, and collectively producing an outcome that was not. The Brotherhood of Steel is simultaneously a romantic image of post-nuclear chivalry and a precise portrait of what happens when military institutions outlast the states that created them and begin operating without external accountability. The Enclave is the government that continued after the collapse of the country it claimed to represent, attempting to maintain legitimacy through assertions of continuity that no surviving population was in a position to evaluate. The NCR is the genuine attempt at democratic reconstruction, limited by all the limitations of democratic reconstruction when the resources it depends on are insufficient for the promises it makes. The wasteland settlers, the people in Megaton, in Diamond City, in Goodsprings, in the dozens of small communities that appear in each game, are the people who have no ideology and no institutional membership and no grand project. They are just trying to get through the day, which is a position the franchise treats with consistent respect. The grand factions of the wasteland make demands on the people who live in it, and the ordinary residents respond to those demands with varying degrees of accommodation and resistance, but always with the priority of survival running underneath everything else they do. Closing. The world is still there. You have been in the wasteland for a long time tonight, longer than a water chip errand, longer than a caravanning run between Goodsprings and the Strip, long enough that the sun has probably moved out there in whatever part of the world you are in, and the quality of the dark has changed if it was dark when you started. The facts we have been through cover 200 years of fictional history built by development teams across 3 decades of actual history in a universe that began with a licensing dispute about violence, grew through the specific genius of people who cared about what it was saying, and has now reached far enough into the world that a television series drew 23 million viewers in 2 weeks. None of it, at its core, is about what comes after the worst possible thing. It is about what people do with the day that comes after that. What they build, who they trust, what they carry and what they put down, and whether the decisions they make in the specific conditions of their specific ruined world add up to something that deserves to be called civilization. The Vault Boy keeps smiling. The ink spots keep playing on frequencies that carry surprisingly well across 200 miles of desert. Somewhere in the files of Vault 11, 5 skeletons rest together in a room where the door finally opened. Somewhere above the Mojave, a rocket is still traveling in a direction that might be hope. If this helped, if the facts and the world helped the night along, subscribe. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. The collection of those comments, the map of where people are listening from in the dark, is genuinely one of the better things about making these. Sleep well. War never changes. But the people who survive it sometimes do. Supplemental Part 1. The art of the wasteland visual design across the franchise. The visual language of Fallout is one of the most immediately recognizable in gaming, and it did not arrive fully formed. It was constructed, argued over, revised, and refined across multiple studios and multiple decades, producing something that has maintained its core identity, even as the technology used to render it changed almost beyond comparison between 1997 and 2024. The color palette of the Bethesda-era games is a specific and conscious choice. The world is largely desaturated gray concrete, brown earth, rust-colored metal punctuated by the specific greens and blues and yellows of preserved pre-war materials. Nuka-Cola machines retain their brand colors. Vault suits maintain their blue and yellow. Radiation produces a sickly green. The contrast between the pre-war color and the post-war gray is always present because it is the visual representation of the franchise's central contrast, what things were supposed to be and what they became. The Vault Boy is the franchise's central graphic character, the cheerful, round-faced figure in the Vault-Tec promotional aesthetic, used for perk illustrations and specule descriptions and loading screen tips. He is visually derived from the mid-century American advertising tradition. Clean lines, simple forms, expressions that communicate a single emotion cleanly without ambiguity. He is always optimistic. He is always competent. His expressions thumbs up, contemplative, wounded are always mediated through the specific filter of institutional optimism that makes them readable as corporate communication, even when the content is describing something unpleasant. The Vault Boy image on a perk called Bloody Mess maintains exactly the same cheerful posture. The gap between the face and the content is Fallout's visual comedy in its purest form. Concept art for the franchise across multiple development eras shows the same recurring tension between two visual impulses: the desire to render the wasteland as genuinely desolate and hostile and visually unwelcoming, and the desire to make it interesting to look at for the dozens of hours players will spend in it. The solution has always been architectural specificity. The ruins of the old world are specific. The architecture of Boston is different from the architecture of Washington, D.C., is different from the architecture of Las Vegas, and the ruins of each reflect what was there before in ways that reward attention. The pre-war world built different things in different places, and the post-war world builds its camps and settlements in and around the ruins of those specific different things, producing a visual landscape that is simultaneously generic and particular. The creature designs have evolved considerably from the first games. The original Deathclaw in Fallout 1 was a sprite, a flat two-dimensional image, and what it communicated was primarily scale and silhouette. The Deathclaw in Fallout 4 is a fully three-dimensional rendered creature with individually articulated claws, muscles visible through the skin, a silhouette that reads as coherent in all lighting conditions, and a movement system that makes it feel heavy in a way that two-dimensional games cannot achieve. The core visual characteristics, the height, the claws, the posture, remain consistent across the gap. The design intention was preserved even as the execution changed completely. Power armor across the generations of games shows the same continuity of intent at different technical levels. The T-51B in Fallout 1's sprite form communicates its essential qualities: large, armored, clearly technological, clearly military. The T-51B in Fallout 4 is the same design philosophy rendered with physically based materials and real-time lighting, and you can trace the visual lineage from the sprite to the model in a way that is genuinely satisfying about how design intent survives technical change. The environmental storytelling, the use of arranged objects in a space to tell a story that no text describes, is one of the franchise's most consistent strengths. A skeleton sitting in a chair in front of a television, with a Nuka-Cola bottle still in what used to be a hand? This is not explained. The game does not label it. You walk into the room and see it, and your mind assembles the story from the available information. The quality of the environmental storytelling has improved across the games, as tools for placing objects and arranging spaces became more sophisticated, but the best examples from Fallout 3 hold up entirely alongside the best examples from Fallout 4 because the skill being exercised is not technical. Supplemental Part 2: The Sound Design of the Wasteland. Fallout's audio design operates in ways that most players absorb without consciously registering. Sound design in games is often discussed in terms of music and voice acting, which are its most immediately perceptible elements. The layer beneath those, the ambient audio, the environmental sounds, the combat feedback signals, is in many ways more important to the experience of presence in the world. The ambient audio of the wasteland changes constantly and quietly. Wind varies in intensity and direction. Different surfaces produce different footstep sounds that correspond to what the character is actually walking on. In areas with active radiation, a low Geiger counter clicking runs beneath the other sounds. Near water rivers, the remains of ponds, the flooded sections of urban ruins, the sound of moving water adjusts for distance and for the player's movement direction relative to its source. None of these sounds call attention to themselves. They are the texture of existing in a space, not decorative elements added to a neutral background. The music in the games is timed to context in ways that are more carefully managed than they appear. Combat music initiates when a hostile creature or enemy detects the player. It does not initiate when the player detects them. The difference is between the player's knowledge and the enemy's, and the music reflects the enemy's state rather than the player's. When the last hostile in an encounter is killed, the music does not immediately cut to ambient. There is a resolution coda, a brief musical passage that completes the combat theme and transitions back to ambient, which communicates to the player, through sound, that the threat level has changed. This is almost invisible as a design choice because it works. When it does not work, when a spawned enemy outside the kill zone extends the combat theme unexpectedly, the failure makes the successful version visible by contrast. The voice acting across the franchise is extensive enough to constitute a meaningful portion of the total audio content. Fallout 4 alone contains approximately 130,000 lines of recorded dialogue. The decision to make the sole survivor a voiced protagonist, unlike the silent protagonists of previous games, required recording all lines in male and female versions, approximately doubling the production load. Some players felt the voiced protagonist reduced the sense of personal investment in the character. Others felt it made the character more real. The debate reflects a genuine tension in role-playing game design: immersion through identification versus immersion through specificity. The Pip-Boy interface sounds the beeps of navigating menus. The specific audio feedback for item selection and map navigation are part of the franchise's audio identity in ways that players who have logged significant hours register physically. The VATS activation sound, the distinctive crack of the interface engaging, has a quality that is simultaneously retro-technological and specifically Fallout. These sounds were designed to be consistent across multiple games, and they are. A player who learned the Pip-Boy's audio feedback in Fallout 3 does not need to relearn it in Fallout 4. The ambient cave sounds, the drips of water, the settling of stone, the distant sounds of things that may or may not be there are managed through the game's mood system in a way that the ambient audio of above-ground spaces is not. The cave sound system tracks how long the player has been in darkness and at low light levels, and incrementally increases the probability of triggering unsettling ambient audio as the darkness accumulates. The player's physical discomfort with the sound is produced by the game's assessment of the character's psychological state, an unusually literal expression of what game audio design is usually doing, metaphorically. Supplemental Part 3. The people who built the world. The Fallout franchise would not exist without a specific set of people whose decisions, creative priorities, and personal values shaped every version of it that has been released. They deserve more than passing mention. Tim Kaine built the first version of Fallout from essentially nothing. He wrote the engine, he designed the special system, he led the team through the transition from GURPS to the proprietary system. He spent years on a project that, at multiple points, his employer Interplay regarded with limited confidence. The game that resulted from that work sold 600,000 copies and established an intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars that Interplay eventually sold for $5.75 million. Sold it because they needed the cash, sold it to a company that would make more of it than Interplay ever would. Tim Kaine has spoken in interviews about the strange feeling of watching the thing you built become something larger than you were present for. He is philosophical about it, which is either wisdom or practice at something that did not stop being hard. Chris Avellone spent years at Black Isle, and then at Obsidian writing some of the most complex and well-regarded characters and questlines in the franchise. His work on the Fallout Bible, the unofficial compendium of lore and background material he compiled while at Black Isle, represents an extraordinary labor of love for a game that, at the time he was writing it, seemed to have no future. The Fallout Bible was his attempt to preserve what he knew about the universe before the people who knew it scattered. His writing for Obsidian's New Vegas DLCs, Old World Blues, Dead Money, Lonesome Road is widely considered the highest point of the franchise's writing. Lonesome Road, in particular, operates as a meditation on the consequences of actions taken without sufficient knowledge, delivered through a companion encounter that requires the player to have lived with the game's world long enough to understand what the conversation is really about. Josh Sawyer's approach to New Vegas was methodological, in a way that contrasts with how most creative projects are described, but reflects how most good creative projects actually work. He set constraints that were not arbitrary: use this engine, ship in 18 months, make every faction internally coherent, and worked within them without treating them as excuses. He has documented his design process extensively in public talks and interviews, and the documentation is one of the more useful bodies of thinking about role-playing game design available. His specific contribution to the franchise is the conviction that moral complexity does not mean nihilism, that a game can present the player with genuinely difficult choices without collapsing into the comfortable position that all choices are equivalent and therefore nothing matters. Todd Howard has led Bethesda Game Studios through Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76, in addition to the studio's other major franchises. His approach to the franchise has been consistently about accessibility, making the Wasteland a place that players who had never heard of the Black Isle games could walk into and care about, and consistently about scale, about the feeling that the world the player is in is genuinely large and genuinely detailed. The specific thing Bethesda brought to Fallout that was not there before was the quality of physical presence. The sense that you are standing in a particular place that has a specific history and a specific quality of light and specific sounds. The first games produce this quality through writing and design. The Bethesda games produce it through rendering and audio and the accumulated weight of detail in three-dimensional space. Both approaches are valid. Both produce things that the other could not. Emile Pagliarulo has been the lead writer at Bethesda Game Studios through the franchise's Bethesda era, and his work is the primary author of The Capital Wasteland and The Commonwealth. The specific tone of Three Dogs broadcasts, the environmental storytelling of Megaton's founding mythology, the backstory of the Institute, these are his contributions. Writing for a game of this scale is not the same task as writing for a novel or a film, and the critical frameworks usually applied to one do not translate cleanly to the other. What the writing of these games needs to do, establish world, deliver lore, provide character motivation, support 100 hours of player activity is a distinct challenge that the results demonstrate having been met. Supplemental Part 4. The franchise's place in the history of the medium. Fallout occupies a specific position in the history of video games that is worth articulating, because the position is unusual. Most franchise histories describe games that arrived, succeeded, declined, and either ended or were rebooted into a form unrelated to the original. Fallout's history describes a franchise that left its original creators, passed through multiple studios, survived the death of the studio that made its best-regarded early entries, reached its commercial peak under a studio that had not been involved with its origins, and then had a second cultural peak through a medium television that had never previously been part of its story. The franchise represents something about the resilience of intellectual properties when the underlying creative vision is strong enough to survive the institutional changes that happen around it. The vaults, the Vault Boy, the 1950s aesthetic, the bottle caps, the themes of institutional failure and personal persistence. These survive the transition from Interplay to Bethesda, from Black Isle to Obsidian, from games to television, because they are coherent enough to be recognizable across different executional approaches. The franchise's identity is not in any single game. It is in the consistent structure of concerns and images and themes that every entry returns to from different angles. The influence of the franchise on subsequent role-playing games is measurable in the techniques that became standard across the genre after its success established them. The use of environmental storytelling objects arranged to tell stories that no text narrates is now a genre standard that was sharpened significantly by Fallout 3's implementation of it. The use of a skill system that directly affects dialogue options, producing different conversations for characters built differently, is a design principle that Fallout helped establish as a genre expectation. The concept of the morally complex faction, whose values the player can interrogate through questline choices, rather than simply fighting against as an antagonistic force, became much more common after New Vegas's implementation of it demonstrated that players would engage with and appreciate the complexity. The franchise has also been the subject of genuine academic attention in ways that most game series have not. The use of the franchise as a case study in discussions of political philosophy, how the NCR and the Legion embody specific political science debates, how the factions of the franchise map onto real political theory, is common enough in game studies literature that it is no longer surprising to encounter. The franchise takes its own themes seriously enough that taking it seriously in return is a reasonable response. The Amazon series represents the franchise's latest transformation, and it is worth noting what the series preserved and what it changed in the process of translating the material to television. It preserved the aesthetic almost entirely the 1950s design language, the Vault Boy, the power armor, the creature designs, the Nuka-Cola brand, the specific quality of wasteland light. It preserved the franchise's tonal approach, dark comedy, and genuine horror and political philosophy in the same story, sometimes in the same scene. It preserved the franchise's fundamental question: who do you trust? What do you build? And what is civilization actually for? What it added was the ability to show the pre-war world directly, to put the viewer inside the Los Angeles of the Fallout universe's 1950s. That never ended, and let them see what was lost and what was already wrong before the bombs fell. The games could only reference the pre-war world through documents and ruins and the emotional weight of its absence. The show can show it, and showing it changes the franchise's argument slightly. We can now see the cheerfulness and the corruption simultaneously, which produces a different kind of clarity than encountering only the ruins. The franchise continues. More games will be made. The world will be extended in directions that have not yet been imagined by anyone currently working on it. Whatever they produce will presumably return, as every version has returned, to the same questions. What happened to the world that was here? And what do we do with the world that is here now? And who gets to decide? These are good questions to fall asleep to. They do not require resolution tonight. Supplemental Part 5. The Forgotten Cut Content and What Was Left Behind. Every major Fallout game shipped with significantly less content than was developed. The proportion of designed, written, and partially implemented content that does not make it into the final release is not unusual in game development. It is the rule, and the Fallout franchise has an unusually well-documented record of what was left behind. Fallout 1 originally included a large city called The Hub as a primary location. The Hub made it into the final game as a trading center. What did not survive were extended storylines centered on Hub politics, a larger variety of factions operating out of the city, and an ending scenario in which the Hub's water merchants played a more pivotal role in the post-war economy. The time constraints of the development schedule meant that large sections of planned Hub content were reduced to stubs or removed entirely, and the released version of the Hub is compressed relative to what the design documents described. The Cathedral, the Master's stronghold in the final game, also underwent significant reduction. The final version has approximately half the planned floors and roughly 2/3 of the planned encounters. NPCs who were supposed to appear in the Cathedral's deeper levels never made it in. Dialogue trees for conversations with children of the Cathedral members were compressed or eliminated. The Master himself received fewer lines than had been written, though what was recorded is among the most effective voice performance in the franchise's history. Fallout 2 has some of the best documented cut content of any game in the genre, largely because the team members have discussed it extensively in the years since. Among the content developed and not shipped, a masticator in New Reno, a villain who ate people and whose questline was developed sufficiently to have multiple resolutions, was cut for time. Several companion characters had full backstory arcs that were developed to completion and then cut when the ship date approached. A subplot involving the Enclave's pre-war activities in California was largely written but never implemented, and its lore has been partially reconstructed by the fan community from dialogue files. Van Buren's cuts are the most significant in the franchise's history, because the game itself was cut, not portions of it, but the entire project. The design documents that survived describe a game that would have been the third mainline entry, set across Utah and Colorado, featuring a player character who began the game as a prisoner escaping from a federal penitentiary and who traveled by vehicle between locations that were physically farther apart than in any previous entry. The factions included a group of scientists at a pre-war research facility who had survived and continued their work, a tribal community with a complex relationship to pre-war technology, and NCR expansion pressing east in ways that created political complications throughout the region. Characters and locations planned for Van Buren eventually appeared in New Vegas, developed by the same people who had worked on Van Buren a decade earlier. Fallout 3 cut content includes Mothership Zeta predecessor content, alien-related material that would have been integrated into the main game rather than released as a DLC, as well as extended questlines for several minor factions and additional personal backstory content for companions. Three Dog originally had more content that directly responded to a wider range of player choices, creating a more detailed feedback loop between the player's actions and his broadcasts. The technical limitations of the radio broadcast system as implemented required simplification of this system. New Vegas's cut content includes what would have been a full companion with a unique questline centered on NCR politics. Design documents and partially recorded dialogue indicate that a character named Ulysses, eventually used as the antagonist of the Lonesome Road DLC, was substantially developed as a base game companion before being cut. The player's history with Ulysses, which is central to Lonesome Road's narrative, would originally have been built across the base game through companion interactions. The DLC restructuring of this content actually gave it more space than the base game would have, but the experience of playing New Vegas is missing something that was designed to be there. Fallout 4 cut content is among the most extensively documented through community modding work, because Bethesda's creation engine has been examined thoroughly by the modding community since Fallout 3. Removed storylines include a more complex questline for the Cabot family, an eccentric pre-war family with access to life extension serum derived from ancient alien technology that had multiple additional stages, and resolutions beyond what shipped. Diamond City's political dynamics were more developed, with additional characters involved in the mayoral storyline. The Railroad had additional members with individual quest lines that were developed and then cut for scope. The Institute's internal politics were more complex, with more factions within the Institute itself and more opportunity to influence internal dynamics. What is consistent across all of this cut content is that the games as released are not the complete creative vision of the teams that made them. They are the portions of that vision that could be completed in time and within the technical constraints available. The gap between the games that were designed and the games that shipped is, depending on your perspective, evidence of what game development always requires compromise with practical constraints, or evidence of what might have been if more time or more resources had been available. Both readings are correct. Supplemental Part 6. The community players who changed the franchise. The Fallout franchise's relationship with its player community is longer and more reciprocal than most franchise histories describe. The first games were developed in direct response to community feedback on early builds posted to message boards. The modding community has, across multiple generations of games, produced content that influenced what official development did next. Fan research has discovered things about the franchise's lore that no official release has described. In some cases, the community found things that the developers themselves did not know were there. The Fallout Bible, referenced earlier, originated as Chris Avalone's attempt to answer fan questions about the franchise's lore that accumulated during the years between Fallout 2 and the Black Isle closure. He compiled what he knew, standardized contradictions between the first two games where possible, and published it as an unofficial resource. The document became canonical reference material for subsequent developers. Obsidian used it extensively when building New Vegas, and it circulated internally at Bethesda during Fallout 3's development. A fan document became institutional lore. The Fallout 3 Restoration Project, the Fallout 2 Restoration Project, and the New Vegas Uncut mods represent the community's most sustained effort to recover what the cut content documentation describes. Modders working from extracted game files, design documents, and interviews with developers have implemented portions of cut content into the games through unofficial modifications. The Fallout 2 Restoration Project in particular is considered by many players to be the definitive version of the game, adding back content that the original development team confirmed was meant to be in the final release. The modding community around Bethesda-era Fallout games has produced an extraordinary volume of content. Estimates for the number of mods available for Fallout 4 through the Nexus Mods platform alone exceed 70,000. These range from small adjustments to individual items or mechanics to complete conversion mods that build entire new games using Fallout 4's engine. The Tale of Two Wastelands project merged Fallout 3 and New Vegas into a single playable experience using the New Vegas engine, creating a combined game that lets players travel between the capital Wasteland and the Mojave. This project required years of work by a dedicated team operating without official support or access to development resources. The lore research community has produced analysis of the franchise's internal history that exceeds in detail what any single official release has provided. The timeline, the year-by-year sequence of events in the Fallout universe from the divergence point in the 1940s to the present day of each game, has been compiled and updated across multiple dedicated wikis. Contradictions between different games' claims have been identified, cataloged, and in many cases resolved through careful cross-referencing of primary sources. The result is an institutional memory of the franchise's lore that is more complete than what any single developer's knowledge provides. The speedrunning community has engaged with the franchise in its own distinctive way, finding roots through game content that the designers did not know existed. The Fallout 1 Any% world record, last checked, sits at approximately 12 minutes, achieved through a sequence of actions that exploit specific dialogue options and inventory management techniques to reach the game's ending through a path that bypasses almost all of its designed content. The record holders know every detail of what they are skipping and why they are skipping it. The relationship between knowing a game thoroughly and moving through it as fast as possible is one of the more interesting dynamics in game culture. The fanfiction and creative writing community has built significant creative work within the franchise's setting, exploring characters and locations and time periods that the official games have not visited. Some of this work is considered by members of the franchise's development community to be among the best things the franchise has inspired. The boundary between fan and official is, in the Fallout community's history, unusually permeable. People who started as fans became modders, became hired developers, bringing community-developed understanding of the franchise into official development. Supplemental Part 7, Into the Deep Dark Fallout's Horror Dimensions. Fallout is not typically classified as a horror franchise, and in aggregate it is not one. But specific pieces of it are horror, and the horror in it is more carefully constructed than the action RPG framing would suggest. The Dunwich locations represent the franchise's most sustained engagement with Lovecraftian cosmic horror. In Lovecraft's tradition, the horror is not in monsters with physical power, but in the encounter with things that are outside the comprehensible forces that make human concepts of scale, time, and agency inapplicable. The Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 work in this register. The player descends into the Boar site expecting ordinary wasteland threats and encounters. Instead, audio logs of workers experiencing increasingly severe psychological disturbances, an ancient obelisk at a depth no mining operation should have reached, and a quality of wrongness that the game's systems cannot fully account for. The combat that occurs there is with recognizable wasteland enemies. The horror is in the suggestion of something behind the combat that the combat does not explain. The Cabot House questline has a horror dimension that is delivered gently enough that some players miss it. A pre-war family with impossible longevity, preserved through a serum of alien origin, has been managing a family member, Lorenzo Cabot, the patriarch who has been imprisoned in an underground vault for over 400 years. Lorenzo is, depending on your reading, either a man who has been driven insane by centuries of confinement or something that the alien artifact he found has transformed into something that should not be interacted with. The questline's ending allows the player to free him or kill him, and the argument Lorenzo makes for his own release, calm, articulate, patient in the way of something that has waited a very long time and has ceased to be in a hurry, is more disturbing than a screaming monster would be. Vault 75 in Fallout 4, underneath the Malden Middle School, operated as a children's testing facility, using the cover of a legitimate school to funnel children into the Vault's combat training and genetic optimization program. The children were not orphans who stumbled in. They were selected from the surrounding community and taken from their families. The Vault's purpose was to produce maximally capable human combatants through a program that was as much eugenics as training. The environment of school, classrooms, hallways with student art still on the walls, a gymnasium converted into combat training space produces the particular horror of the recognizable place transformed. Point Lookout, a Fallout 3 DLC set in a fictionalized version of the real Point Lookout State Park in Maryland, is the franchise's most complete horror setting. The location is a wetland environment, marshes, dark water, Spanish moss, fog that has produced a specific post-war culture among its inhabitants. The tribal communities of Point Lookout have developed practices around a local plant with powerful psychedelic properties. The main questline involves a mission through the ritual site that requires the player to drink the local brew and experience a sequence that functions as the franchise's most explicit, hallucinatory horror passage. The cultish energy of the location, the specific quality of the swamp environment's fog and sound design, and the questline's general refusal to resolve cleanly into either the good or the bad outcome distinguish Point Lookout as the entry in the franchise most interested in horror for its own sake. The Glowing Sea, referenced earlier as the crater region of Fallout 4, functions as a horror environment through environmental design rather than narrative construction. The radiation density produces visible distortion in the air. The creatures are more extreme variants of already extreme wasteland types. The settlements that exist within it are survivalists who have adapted to conditions that would be rapidly lethal for most visitors. A direct nuclear impact site, 200 years on, maintained as a present horror by the ongoing reality of what was done to it. This is the franchise's most direct environmental argument about what nuclear weapons actually do to places. The final word. You have now been in the wasteland for the length of a full night's journey. The facts you have carried through these sections, the GURPS licensing dispute, the Vault-Tec experiments, the cut content, and the community that recovered it, the horror dimensions and the economic structures, and the geographic specificity, and the religions that emerged from specific ruined conditions. All of it together constitutes something larger than a list of trivia. It is an account of a fictional universe that was built by real people who cared about it, extended by other real people who cared about it, interpreted and preserved and modified and loved by a community of people who found in its questions something worth returning to. The world that ended on the 23rd of October 2077, in the fiction, is a monument to everything that can go wrong when human institutions stop being accountable to the people they claim to serve. The world that emerged from it, in the games and the show, is a monument to the proposition that people keep going anyway. This is a comfortable thing to know. Not a happy thing necessarily, but comfortable in the way that accurate things are comfortable even when the accuracy is not good news. The world ended. People kept going. The radio kept playing. The bottle caps kept changing hands. And on any given in-game morning, somewhere in the capital wasteland, or the Mojave, or the Commonwealth, someone is waking up and deciding what to do with the day. We hope your day is easier than theirs. We hope your night is quiet in the ways that matter. If you have been here this long and found it useful for sleep, for background, for the particular comfort of being talked at by something that knows a lot about a world that is very far from anything urgent, please subscribe. There are more of these. More worlds to spend a night in. More quiet facts about things that are large enough to think about and gentle enough to think about while your eyes are closed. Leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is there. That collection of times and places accumulated in the comments of this video is genuinely one of the better things that making this work produces. Sleep well, war never changes, rest well anyway. Supplemental Part 8. The Merchants, the Caravans, and the Economy of Movement. The Fallout Wasteland's economy does not operate through central planning or a single governing exchange. It operates through movement. Caravans move between settlements, carrying goods and information and, in some cases, people who need to travel without traveling alone. The merchant caravans of the franchise are the circulatory system of the wasteland economy, not glamorous, not heavily armed by the standards of the region's power factions, but essential in the way that supply chains are always essential and only become visible when they stop working. The Gunrunners in Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas are one of the franchise's most consistent commercial presences. They manufacture weapons. This is not common. Most wasteland weapons dealers are distributors of pre-war equipment or scavengers who refurbish found material. The Gunrunners maintain actual fabrication capacity, the machines, the knowledge, the supply chains for raw materials, and the skilled labor to run a functioning factory. Their headquarters in New Vegas is inside an armored facility surrounded by a moat that discourages approach from people who have not come to buy. Their merchandise is reliable. Their prices reflect the scarcity of what they do. The Crimson Caravan Company in New Vegas is the franchise's most developed portrayal of a post-war commercial enterprise, a company rather than simply a merchant, with employees, policies, contracts, internal politics, and a CEO whose decisions affect trade throughout the Mojave. The company is not a good actor in any simple sense. They maintain their market position through a combination of superior logistics, financial leverage over competitors, and occasionally more direct forms of competition suppression. The questline that involves them requires the player to navigate between their interests and the interests of smaller traders they are attempting to eliminate. The game does not resolve this into a clean moral outcome. The Crimson Caravan is a company operating logically within the constraints of a post-war economy. The constraints produce behavior that is harmful to individuals and beneficial to the overall system. This is familiar. Water merchants in the California region, referenced across the first two games and their supporting lore documents, built the first post-war economic institution powerful enough to give a currency its backing. The water merchants of the hub, by agreeing to exchange bottle caps for water at a fixed rate, created the conditions for a currency that could function across a region where no government existed to mandate its use. This is, in simplified form, how currencies actually emerge from commodity-backed barter systems. The game's economic lore is doing something real. The Nuka-Cola Corporation's distribution infrastructure, the bottling plants, the delivery routes, the vending machines that still function on whatever pre-war power sources survive represents a ghost economy in the post-war world. The machines dispense to anyone with the appropriate caps. The company that programmed them no longer exists. The supply chains that stocked them have been severed for 2 centuries. When a Nuka-Cola vending machine still works in the wasteland, it is because it was stocked before the 23rd of October, 2077, and the beverages inside are 200 years old. This is a detail that the games do not emphasize and that most players absorb as background texture. It is also, in its quiet way, a precise image of what the franchise is about. The infrastructure of a dead civilization still functioning on its original momentum, decades past the moment when someone was supposed to come and refill it. The junk economy, the collection, transport, and trading of pre-war manufactured goods for their material components is the wasteland's version of recycling infrastructure. Settlement workshops, crafting stations, and the workbench systems of Fallout 4 all depend on a continuous supply of junk items that are extracted from the ruins and broken down into components. The people who perform this collection, scavengers, in the wasteland's occupational taxonomy occupy a social position that is somewhere between respected and disdained. They make the economy work in a way that almost nothing else makes possible, and they do it in dangerous conditions, and their compensation reflects the supply and demand dynamics of a labor market with more dangerous jobs than workers willing to take them. The barter skill in the games is one of the most consistently useful secondary skills across the franchise's entire run. Characters with high barter get better prices from merchants not because merchants are kind to them, but because they have the knowledge and technique to negotiate effectively. The existence of this as a modeled skill reflects the franchise's understanding that trade in the wasteland is not a fixed-price system. Everything is negotiable. The person who knows more about the value of what they are trading and what they are accepting has a structural advantage that is quantifiable. The games make this quantifiable through a skill system. The economy makes it real through scarcity. Supplemental Part 9. The Question of the Synths. The synthetic human synths of Fallout 4 are the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of what constitutes personhood, and the game's willingness to sit with this question without answering it cleanly is one of its most significant creative choices. First and second generation synths are not controversial. First generation synths are clearly robotic, metal, mechanical, obviously manufactured. Second generation synths have more humanoid bodies but are still recognizably artificial. Neither category produces significant philosophical discussion in the game's world, because neither category is easily confused with the baseline human. Third-generation synths are the question. They are biologically indistinguishable from humans through any observation available to most characters. They bleed. They experience pain. They have individual personalities. Some of them have memory-wiped backstories that make them believe they are the original humans they were modeled on or produced to replace. Nick Valentine's second-generation synth body contains the memories of a pre-war detective. There is extensive in-game discussion about whether this constitutes Nick Valentine being Nick Valentine, or an approximation of him, or something new that has been shaped by those memories without being the person who originally had them. The Railroad operates on the premise that third-generation synths are persons whose enslavement is an atrocity equivalent to any other. Their mission is to extract synths from the Institute and give them new identities, new memory wipes, new names, relocation to settlements far from the Institute's reach. This mission is conducted at significant personal risk by Railroad members who accept the moral weight of their position as sufficient reason to keep going. The game presents the Railroad's position as internally coherent and the motivation of its members as genuine. It does not endorse it definitively over other positions. The Brotherhood of Steel under Elder Maxon operates on the premise that third-generation synths are machines whose ability to mimic human behavior makes them more dangerous than machines that do not. A robot that everyone recognizes as a robot cannot infiltrate. A robot that no one can distinguish from a human has infiltrated everywhere. The Brotherhood's position is a security argument rather than a philosophical one, and the game presents it as internally coherent even as it produces outcomes that are, from the Railroad's perspective, atrocities. The destruction of synths who believe they are persons, who experience distress at the prospect of destruction, is not narrated as obviously correct by the game. It is narrated as the Brotherhood's answer to a question that the game itself refuses to answer. The Institute's position is that synths are tools. The Institute built them. The Institute controls them. What the Institute's synths think or feel is a design parameter, not a moral fact. This position is harder to maintain in contact with actual synths than in the abstract, and several Institute characters, including a significant one encountered in the main questline, have private doubts that the official position cannot accommodate. The game gives these doubts space without resolving them into obvious moral clarity. What Fallout 4 does with the synth question that is most interesting is that it does not put the definitive answer in the game. The player can choose a position and act on it. The game will support that choice through its faction systems. But there is no terminal entry, no NPC conversation, no late-game revelation that settles the question of whether synths are persons in a way that would make the other positions obviously wrong. The uncertainty is the design. The question of what conditions are sufficient for personhood is one that philosophy has not answered in our world, and the game is honest about this by not answering it in its fiction. The absolute end. There are more facts about Fallout than any video could contain. There are more details in each individual game than any single playthrough reveals. There are developer interviews from 1,998 that contain information about the creative decisions behind Fallout, one that most players of the Bethesda-era games have never encountered. There are wiki pages about minor characters who appear for one scene in Fallout 2 that are longer and more carefully researched than many published academic articles about film. The universe invites this kind of attention because it rewards it. Small details connect to larger patterns. Individual character choices reflect institutional structures. The contents of a terminal entry in a ruined building tell you something about the civilization that built the building that the building's architecture alone could not. The franchise has built something genuinely worth paying attention to, and the people who pay attention to it tend to find that there is always more. Tonight's collection covered the origins and the vaults, the creatures and the factions, the weapons and the music and the lore, the development histories and the cut content, the geography and the religions and the economy and the art and the sound, the people who built it and the community that received it and extended it, the horror and the moral complexity and the philosophical questions without clean answers. All of it, in the end, is in service of the franchise's central proposition that after everything ends, there is a morning. And in that morning, people are going to have to make decisions about what to do. The decisions they make, small and large, individual and collective, selfish and generous and confused and principled, are what the world that comes after looks like. This is enough to fall asleep knowing. It is enough to carry into whatever morning follows. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. If it helped, subscribe and leave a comment with your corner of the world and the time that it is there. The record of where people are when they find these, the lateness of the hour, the distance from the studio, the specific Tuesday night or Sunday morning of it, matters more than these things usually matter. Sleep well. Take care. War never changes. People sometimes do. A final note on the nature of lore. Lore is the word gaming communities use for the accumulated internal history of a fictional universe. It is a useful word because it does not carry the literary weight of world building or the academic weight of mythology. It is just the things that are true about this place. The facts that have been established through the games and the shows and the design documents and the developer interviews and the wiki pages maintained by people who care about the way this particular version of a ruined America works. Lore is also, in practice, a form of shared language. When two Fallout players talk to each other, they share access to a vocabulary that is simultaneously fictional and completely real in the sense that both of them know what the words mean and both of them have feelings about it. Saying the words Vault 11 to someone who has played New Vegas is not just identifying a fictional location. It is referencing an experience that produced a specific emotional response, which the speaker and listener both have access to in their own way, and which the word calls back up. The franchise has been generating this shared language since 1997. 27 years of lore, built incrementally and sometimes inconsistently across studios and platforms and generations of players. The people who played the first game when it was new are now in their 40s and 50s, and some of them have played it with their children. The people who came to the franchise through Fallout 3 are in their 30s. The people who came through the Amazon series are arriving now, for the first time, into a universe that has 27 years of accumulated texture waiting for them. All of them share access, now, to the same vocabulary. The Vault Boy is the Vault Boy. The bottle caps are the bottle caps. The 1950s aesthetic is the 1950s aesthetic. The question, what do you do with the morning after the worst thing has already happened, is the question for all of them wherever they came in. This is a good thing to have in common across a planet. Modest as shared things go, but genuine. The fire in your screen is very small compared to the size of the night outside. The wasteland is quiet at this hour. Rest well. One more thing. The dogs of the wasteland. There is a reason Dogmeat keeps coming back. Across 4 mainline games, Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, and Fallout 4, a German Shepherd with the same name accompanies the player through the wasteland. Not the same dog, in the lore's continuity. Different dogs in different centuries and different regions and different circumstances. But the same name, and the same breed, and the same basic relationship. A human moving through a ruined world, and a dog that chose to come along. The first Dogmeat can be recruited by approaching the dog near a specific building in the hub area of Fallout 1. He was there for someone who died. He stays for you. If you are patient enough and make the right choices in the approach, he can be killed. When he is killed, he is gone. He does not respawn. This was the design decision that produced the Fallout 4 design decision to make Dogmeat invincible. Someone learned from the accumulated grief of players who lost their dog in 1997 and decided not to do that again. What makes the returning presence of Dogmeat across the franchise meaningful is not anything specific about German Shepherds. It is what the dog represents in the context of a world where everything is ruined and most relationships are contingent and almost nothing is reliable. The dog is reliable. The dog does not have a political agenda. The dog does not have a faction affiliation that the player might disagree with. The dog does not ask questions about the nature of synths or the legitimacy of the NCR or the theological dimensions of atomic fire. The dog is there. The dog is glad you are there. In the wasteland, this turns out to be enough. In a lot of conditions, it turns out to be enough. Fallout 76, which launched without any non-player characters in its initial form, the first Fallout game to make this choice, still had a Dogmeat analog available through gameplay. Players could find and tame dogs. The absence of human companions was widely noted as a loss. The dogs were not a sufficient replacement in the view of many players, because the dog's presence matters most in relation to a human world. A dog and a human moving through a ruined world together is a story. A dog moving through a ruined world alone, while other players also have dogs, is a different kind of story. The Amazon television series has its own dog. The Ghoul Cooper Howard, pre-war actor turned 2-century-old wanderer, has a dog. The dog is present in a significant portion of the show's wasteland sequences. The creative team made this choice knowing what they were doing, knowing the franchise's history with dogs, knowing that the audience would receive the presence of a dog alongside a wasteland wanderer as a specific kind of signal about the character and the story. They were right to know this. The signal is real. There is something in the franchise's consistent return to this image, the person, the wasteland, the dog that resists reduction into a simple statement about companionship or loyalty or the persistence of relationships across catastrophe. It is all of those things. It is also something simpler, a demonstration that in a world where almost everything has ended, some things just kept going. And one of those things was the particular decision a domesticated animal made 10,000 years ago to stay near people. That decision survived the bombs. It survived the radiation. It survived 200 years of difficult conditions and difficult choices and difficult mornings. The dog is still there. The radio is still playing. The bottle caps are still moving between hands in the dark. This is where we leave the wasteland tonight.